وصحبه وسلم. O Allah, grant us a soft tongue that always remembers and mention your name, a heart that is full of gratitude of your blessing, a light body that is obedient to your commands. O Allah, grant us perfect faith, a humble heart, useful knowledge, and truly firm conviction. O Allah, grant us a wise and excellent way of life, and save us from all dangers and disasters. We ask you, O Allah. We ask you, Allah, for sufficiency, so that we do not have to rely on the help of others. O Allah, give us true faith, so that we do not fear or hope for anyone other than you. Spread your mercy upon us, our families, our children, and all those who are with us. O Allah, do not leave our fate to be determined by ourselves, even for the blink of an eye or an easy or fast way. O Lord, who answer prayers, please grant us our request. O Allah, in conjunction of BIMB Securities ESG Corporate Day event today, do guide us to be among those whom you have guided. Do grant us a good health and forgiveness, so that we shall be among those whom you have granted good health and forgiveness. O Allah, you are you are the most forgiving and the most merciful, and you love to forgive. Therefore forgive all our sins. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين والحمد لله رب العالمين. آمين يا رب العالمين.
Amin, Amin, Ya Rabbal Alamin. Thank you, Imran, for the recitation. Allow me to present to you our itinerary for today. And I would like to wish a very good morning to our distinguished guest speakers for today's special event. Yang Berusaha Datuk Profesor Ulung Dr. Rajah Rasia, Executive Director Asia Europe Institute AEI of University Malaya. Yang Berusaha Profesor VGR Chandran Govindaraju, Deputy Dean of Value Creation and Enterprise of University Malaya. And Yang Berusaha Dr. Rosnani Rasul, Acting Chief Executive Officer of BIMB Securities. And to our entire guests for today. Welcome to BIMB Securities' first event for this year, the Economics Virtual Corporate Day. We appreciate you taking time off your busy schedules to join us for this event. As we move towards the end of the first quarter in 2024, Malaysia's economic growth faces challenges due to a blend of both domestic and external factors, adding to the headwinds confronting the nation. Nevertheless, Malaysia's economy has regained momentum, moving beyond a phase of downturn and displaying an enhanced growth rate. Hence, we are fortunate to have with us today our special guest speakers, Datuk Professor Ulung Dr. Rajah Rasia and Professor VGR Chandran Govindaraju, to give further insights on the Malaysia's economic trajectory through the lens of the New Industrial Master Plan 4, known as the NIMP4, as well as the future of manufacturing and its implications for growth prospects. I believe that all of us will benefit and be enlightened after the presentations. So before we move on to the main agenda, please allow me to invite our Acting Chief Executive Officer, Dr. Rosnani Rasul, to give her opening remarks. Please welcome Dr. Rosnani.
Assalamualaikum. Very good morning to everyone. Thank you for making time to join us into our first corporate day of the year. Not that this will be the first of a series of corporate day that will be organizing this year. Before I begin, I would like to say thanks to Bursa Malaysia. This is a collaboration of BIMB Securities with Bursa Malaysia, and we would like to say our great appreciation to both speakers, Dr. Raja and also Dr. Professor Chandran, for able to make time to join us today. Indeed, the topic today is very interesting. In time, Bank Negara Malaysia just released their annual report yesterday, and then yesterday, US Federal Reserve just announced what they call their policy statement that is actually very great for us to know. So today is actually a day that we can shed the light on what would in store for Malaysia. Indeed, let's go into the first of Professor Raja Dato Professor Ulung Dr. Raja topic, which is on NIM 4. Now, we all know that Malaysia has been in the middle income trap for some time. We need a game changer. We need a new strategy. We need a new push to actually pull us up into the high income nation. I think at last info, the government is expecting us to actually get lifted into the high income nation, if I'm not mistaken, in 2027 or 2028. So now NIM 4, Professor Dr. Raja will be able to shed the light. Okay, what would actually be what you call the driving factor, given that there are selected sectors picked by the government for the NIM 4, among others are aerospace, chemical, E&E, medical device, automotive, and food processing. He will be able to give us, okay, what to expect this Malaysian economy, particularly, especially when we actually, ringgit has not been doing very well. So could this, the ringgit undervalued will be able to be among the factors that actually could push the demand for what they call for our products, and hence break us out from the middle income trap. Now, Professor Professor Chandran will be talking about manufacturing. Now, manufacturing contribute estimated about 30% of the GDP, is very important for us. Manufacturing was a drag for us last year, so we would like to hear what is the future for Malaysia. Yeah. Now, noted that our PMI for January actually has been on the rise. I think reaching close to 15 neutral level. But we are not what do you call satisfied with that. We want to see Malaysia PMI rising along with the regional peers, which already crossed the 50 neutral level. So we would like to hear from Professor Chandran what we have in store for manufacturing per se. In light of that, we are also very concerned if, let's say, the US presidential election, the candidate previously, like Donald Trump, let's say he get elected, which we hope not, would he pick a fight again with those countries that have trade surplus? So what would be our defense this time around? Because quite likely that he's going to pick another fight with China for the second US-China trade war. Now, yesterday, Bank Negara Malaysia, we are happy to say that they announced their 2023 annual report. In that, they pencil in a Malaysian GDP growth for 4 to 5%. BIMB Securities and Bank Islam, we have a GDP target of Malaysian GDP target 2024 at 4.7. 4.7, in our view, is within our potential. Yeah, our potential is about 6, so we don't foresee any pressure to the inflation just yet. However, Bank Negara did mention that private consumption, although it may grow about 5.7%, there could be some impact in the second half because of the implementation of the subsidy rationalization. Therefore, that would be one of the downside risks for Malaysian GDP. Now, another downside risk for Malaysian GDP could be from a geopolitical risk. We know that the war in the Middle East has been going on, no sign of slowing down. Russia-Ukraine is going into their third year. So all that is actually our downside risk. However, based on our view, what we saw in the annual report, Malaysian upside risk to the GDP growth is there. We're happy to say that services sector is coming to a full turnaround to be propelled by export-oriented goods and export-oriented services. We hope that number of tourists will be able to reach close to 30 million this year, compared to last year, I think about 20 to 35 million, thanks to the visa-free initiative by the government for big population countries like China, India, Middle East, and also ASEAN. Yeah. Yesterday, also just to highlight some very good news, US FOMC announced their March policy decision. We have been expecting no change in the federal fund rate. It was unchanged nonetheless, but more importantly, what would be the policy statement? Now, policy statement mentioned that they could begin there could be 3 policy rate cut in the second half this year, something that we have been informing our client. We have been telling our clients since last year that we think that the federal fund rate will maybe cut in 2024. We hope that it will be in the range of 75 to 100 basis points. Now, on that score, we hope ringgit will rebound, because we have been waiting for this good news, a direction for a guidance by the US FOMC. So finally, ringgit will have its field day. Hopefully, it will able to touch. We have a year-end target of ringgit about 4.45. So let's not take the shine out of our speakers that is waiting in the lobby. Thank you to both professors, distinguished professors. That is actually the second time that we are actually having them for our corporate day. We truly appreciate a very respectable figure in the field of economics. Let's hear from them, and do stay tuned until 12:30. There are quite a number of people today joining us at last count. I think about 190 people. If you have any question, do type on the chat box. Or otherwise you can always ask both speakers at the end of the session for both. So thank you again for joining us today for our first. We have another one next week, which is on the ESG, and a few more coming up in the first half. Do join us as well. For Bursa Malaysia, thank you for collaborating with us for the second year. We hope this will be many more years to come. Other than that, let me pass to the MC again. Selamat Ramadan for the Muslim and also for all the Malaysian. And thank you, Sabrina. Over to you.
Thank you for the opening remarks, Dr. Rusnani. And moving on, for our upcoming session, we are pleased to have our Chief Economist, Encik Imran Nujinias, who will be presenting on the economics outlook. But before we begin, please allow me to provide a brief overview of his background. Encik Imran brings 25 years of research experience in economics, capital markets, and currencies. His career spans various banking sectors before transitioning to research roles at MIDF Investment Bank, Kuwait Finance House Global Research, and M Investment Bank. He holds a bachelor's in economics from the University of New England, Australia, and is a certified Islamic Finance Executive, CIFE, from the Ethika Institute of Islamic Finance, Dubai. He completed his master's in comparative financial studies at University Islam Malaysia and is currently pursuing a PhD in comparative finance at the same institution. So, without further delay, please welcome Encik Imran to the floor.
Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and very good morning. Thank you, Sabrina. What I'm going to talk today is just a brief outlook on the global economy as well as the domestic economy. So when we look at the global economy as per in the slide 3, it seems possible that the global economy might be doing okay. The forecast for the 2034 global GDP has remained so far, and if you look at if the economic surprise of 2033 was the persistence of inflation, then for 2034, so far it has been the persistence of growth in the face of higher interest rates. So basically, we predicted growth a bit synchronized across major markets, and support to activity is expected from 2 key sources. One is a boost to household real incomes from lower inflation, and the other one is more accommodative financial conditions. But in the next slide, we see that ASEAN so far has made notable strides in the pre-pandemic decade thanks to the favorable demographics, improving infrastructure and manufacturing industries, and surging foreign direct investment. But COVID-19 pandemic sparked supply chain disruption and travel restrictions that hit industrial and also tourism activity in the region. So in 2022-2023, the ASEAN GDP growth notably outpaced the global average, boosted by ample stimulus package, the gradual recovery of the tourism and efforts by the multinational companies to diversify global supply chains away from China, and the rising tourist inflows, cooling inflation, and the global electronic sector upturn should boost the ASEAN GDP growth to above 2023's growth. And ASEAN will be the fastest growing region in the world in the next decade thanks to the FDI inflows, infrastructure development, favorable demographic, and also the expansion of consumer markets in key trading partners, particularly China and India. Because if you look at growth in China and India, we expect both countries to continue to provide steady high growth, but still the concern is on China, because we know that currently China is facing with the downturn in the property sectors and slow internal domestic demand. So that might pull down the China growth. But nevertheless, I think the regional countries, ASEAN countries, will still benefit from the expansion in economic growth from both India and China. Okay, in the next slide, we see that the global purchasing index, or PMI data, which signal a further improvement in economic conditions, and output indices for manufacturing and services also expand at the expansion level of 50 in February for the first time since mid-2022. The aggregate composite output index for the emerging economies continue to outperform in developed economy equivalent. So while the manufacturing conditions remain relatively subdued, especially in the Western Europe, there have been recent positive signs in the form of the rise in the global PMIs, order to inventory ratio, and also improving export orders. So the improving export orders is a leading indicator of trends in the global trade. So what we are seeing now so far, PMI data for the first 2 months of this year had shown that a rather limited effect from the disruption of shipping routes, which are supportive of our view that inflationary impact will be relatively contained in the absence of the additional major geopolitical risks. So persistent strength in labour market was responsible for much of this growth, and consumer spending on services was a strong factor in driving lower unemployment rates, since services tend to be labour intensive, and the continued strength of labour market supported the narrative of a soft landing in the global economy. So in the next slide, we see that a soft landing in the global economy would require inflation rates to shrink to target rates of about 2%, and while GDP maintain growth, or at least did not contract too much. So the central bankers have set high interest rate to reduce inflation, as what we've seen since 2022, where central banks have been hiking the interest rate, but there's always a danger that they may be too effective and tip the global economy into recession. So, of course, the good economic news always contains the seed of bad economic news. So the stickiness of the labour market and also spending on services indicated demand growth that is too strong, which is contributed to the slow decline in inflation rates. So when people are making more money, their demand for goods and services drive up prices, and in economies such as the Eurozone and perhaps China, where demand growth has been weaker, inflation rates have come down more quickly. So consumer price inflation is still projected to fall from the 2023 annual average, but this inflation has become more uneven in recent months. So while sticky services prices remain a concern, we continue to expect a gradual moderation, as which growth continue to show a gradual easing of pay pressures. In contrast, core good consumer price inflation continue to fall. So in the next slide, we see that the central banks interest rate, and we know that the part of the reason growth has remained persistent is that markets expect interest rate to fall over the course of 2024. And as Dr. Nani mentioned earlier, the Fed had maintained the Federal rate at 5.25 to 5.5 for in the meeting yesterday, and we predicted that any lowering of interest rate by the Federal Reserve will come in June. So this development reflect continued growth, resilience, and firmer inflation data. So we now expect only about 75 basis point of rate cuts in total in the US during this year, and our initial forecast of the ECB, European Central Bank, and the Bank of England by mid of this year remain unchanged. The US dollar rebound early in the year has faded, with the currency losing ground against the yen, euro, and pound sterling. But after the BOJ increased the interest rate 2 days ago, we saw that yen had weakened slightly against the US dollar. So, but we continue to see the fundamentals favoring a depreciation trend of the dollar. So, question now is in slide 9, basically I think consumer spending varied across the world, and consumer spending was lower at the start of the year. That is in January after the traditional holiday session. And the retail sales report is the latest in the sign that retailers are still feeling the strain from the rise in the prices and also interest rate over the last 2 years. So if you look at China, even though the country has been ramping up measures to overcome the prolonged property downturn, the real estate crisis undermined consumer confidence further. And as a result, this has caused the country's household to be cautious in their spending, and retail sales in China has slowed to 5.5% in January, February, and on monthly basis, that momentum was near flat at 0.03% month-on-month in February. So it shows that weaker consumer demand was reflected in China's CPI as well. Although the CPI increased by 0.7% year-on-year in February, but it was lifted by the stronger demand during the Chinese New Year, as the headline inflation was flat in the first 2 months of 2034, while the core inflation averaged 0.8% year-on-year. So what we are looking here is that any recovery in prices will unlikely be strong because domestic demand is expected to be subdued, while asset prices is still facing downward pressure. But in contrast, the private spending made about 69% of the GDP for the US, and strong performance in the labour market, as reflected in the steady hiring, has sent the unemployment rate down to below 4% for the 2 straight years. And as a result, we see more jobs, which means more income, and which generally means more spending. So with the US economy's strength resting heavily on household spending, eyes will be on the consumer and how consumer will respond in the next few months to the Federal Reserve ongoing efforts to tame the inflation. In the next slide, basically shows that there's always headwinds and challenges in the global economy outlook, and the serious disruption to global supply chain could cause inflation to spike again and delay rate changes. And at the top of the list, threats to global supply chains are geopolitical disruptions, including the war in Ukraine, the Israel-Hamas war, the attacks in the Red Sea, and tensions in the South China Sea. So if this disruption intensifies, fewer goods will reach consumers and prices will climb for what remains. So moving to the domestic economy, in the next slide, these are our key indicators for 2024, and so far for 2023, growth disappoints. The final fourth quarter GDP came in lower than expected at 3%. which brought the full year growth to 3.7%. The large part of the weakness was due to the decline in external demand that weighed on the manufacturing sectors. Services sector growth half as post-pandemic spending normalized, while higher cost of living bites consumers' pocket. So that's why we're seeing slower demand for last year. But the government spending posted stable growth as public investment rose, while private spending remained a key contributor, although it's slightly softer at both private consumption and so investment growth moderated. So still we looking at GDP growth about 4.7%. As we know, yesterday Bank Negara come up with their forecast where they expect GDP to grow by 4 to 5%, similar as what MOF had projected earlier. So we are almost at the midpoint of official growth forecast. But basically, our GDP forecast for 2024 reflect our expectation of a rebound in the manufacturing sector, and this optimism particularly rooted in the export-oriented segment, driven by the technology upswing and also China's gradual economic recovery. So there are still downside risks to our projection, and they mainly stem from the external development, and global growth could slow more sharply than expected, and the intensifying geopolitical tension and the resulting fragmentation could amplify the slowdown, and later than expected interest rate cuts in advanced economy also could have an impact on the global growth. So in the next slide shows that one of the components of domestic demand, which is private consumption, which accounts for the largest part of the GDP, has been and will continue to be the key growth driver. And we expect growth in consumer spending to be driven by strong domestic demand, supported by stable and lower unemployment rate, which are projected to average around 3.3% this year. And this positive outlook is reinforced by the continued increase in tourist arrivals and spending. But risks to our forecast include the impact of subsidy rationalization, which could potentially dampen consumer spending and subsequently affect sales growth. And as you all know, the government will be implementing several key policy reforms in 2024 to improve government spending efficiency and reduce subsidy allocation and enhance revenue through new tax measures and tax hikes. So among the notable measures, what we had seen so far is the higher service tax rate of 10%, the low value good tax, the luxury tax. The luxury tax will be implemented by 1st May, and the plan of the retargeting of subsidies, and we've said the higher water tariff as well as the electricity tariff. So basically, these policy changes and also this subsidy rationalization program is expected to take effect from most of the year, from the second half of the year onwards, and that could potentially reduce household disposable income. So that will constrain consumption growth. So, but the impact will depend on the implementation, as the government is still finalizing on the SRI and also has reassured that the subsidy rationalization will be gradual. So the much anticipated progressive wage policy, which focus on lifting the wages of the workers, is scheduled to be piloted in middle of this year, and that could provide some cushion to the impact. But still, the potential second round effects from the implementation of progressive wage mechanism and higher cash keys upside risk to the inflation outlook. Again, in the next slide, we see that the services sector emerged as the key driver to growth in 2023, backed by the wholesale and also retail trade. And overall, Malaysian consumer demand remained resilient and is in tandem with the healthy job market's development and softening inflationary pressures. So Overall, Malaysia's consumer demand remained robust, and we've seen that the distributive trade growth expanded around 5.4% in January, and lifted by growth in the wholesale trade and also retail trades subsectors, which increased by 5.5 and 2.6% respectively. So, positive outlook in the services sector and also retail sales is reinforced by the continued increase in tourist arrivals and spending, and we expect growth in spending to be driven by strong domestic demand, supported by stable and lower unemployment rate. In the next slide, we mentioned about tourism as one of the key sectors that support the economic growth, and we know that the tourism has embarked on the road of recovery following the hit by the COVID-19, and last year Malaysia recorded about 20.1 million tourist arrivals, generating about 71.3 billion of income. So we expect this sector to expand further in 2024, and government had expected arrivals of around 27.3 million with income of 102.7 billion for this year. And in encouraging more tourists coming to Malaysia, the government had also announced a new policy permitting 30 days of free entry for Chinese and Indian nationals, as well as those from the Middle East. So the next slide shows that the population of these three countries and region are very high. So therefore we expect number of tourists to continue to come into Malaysia, and that will boost the services and also the income for the country. Okay, on the next slide shows that the investment which will likely sustain positive momentum in the coming quarters with the ongoing infrastructure project and also construction development in the pipeline, such as projects such as ECRL, the Pemboni Highway, Penang RT, and so on. We give a positive contribution to the to the domestic economy. So, but the most important thing is the implementation of this plan, which it hinges on various factors such as efficient and timely regulatory frameworks and also effective stakeholder engagement. And in the next slide, we shows that we expect global demand to stage a modest recovery, and we foresee that foreign trade will recover in 2034, winning external headwinds as the global financial market move towards equilibrium. So this will largely reflect a hangover from the pandemic era disruption, particularly following the front loading of orders and amid the supply chain disruption. So this will support new export and manufacturing activities, and which will sustain partially by a mild rebound in global electronic demand. So the outlook for services trade is also positive as global tourism is continuing to recover, and we see that in the next slide that after robust growth of rebound of 8.7% in January, exports reverse course and fell back into contraction territory in February, down by negative 0.8%. But despite the marginal drop in February, cumulative exports for the first 2 months of the year was at around 3.9%, and that basically reinforced our view that trade recovery is underway, a bit bumpy. So the performance in 2024 would be somewhat choppy due to the seasonality effects during the festive period, as well as the potential disruption and delays from the Red Sea crisis. But the continued strength in import demand, particularly for the imports of intermediate goods and would push the shows that there will be a positive export trend in the coming months. So moving forward in the next slide, we believe that global economic stabilization in 2024 will lead to recovery in the trade and thus far spur our factory activities. As mentioned by Dr. Nani, our PMI had increased to 49.5 in February and edging closer to neutral level. So that shows that there's a potential for manufacturing sectors moving forward. And next slide, we see that what is supporting our economy currently is the stabilization in the interest rate, and OPR will likely stay flat at 3%. And we expect to see the OPR to remain at 3% throughout the year. But Bank Negara also indicated that they will also be mindful of the external development, including the currency. So although we expect to see the OPR to remain at 3%, but at the same time, Bank Negara will also monitoring the external effects and also on the data and also the currency, just to make sure that the current OPR remain accommodative to our economy. So just in the next slide, just a slight view on the ringgit. Basically, we see that the ringgit had weakened in the February and touched 480. But since then, it had pulled back and currently trading around 472. So we know that the ringgit, which as what the central bank is saying, is undervalued. So we are looking at ringgit to gradually strengthen throughout the year, and we expect ringgit to reach 445 by the end of the year. So, but I think although we are quite encouraged by what is going on in the first 2 months of the year for the domestic economy, there are also downside risks to our projection, and they mainly stem from external development. The downside risks to our growth outlook for Malaysia could emanate from one is the escalation of geopolitical risks, including wider conflicts in the Middle East, and also which might disrupt the oil supplies and higher shipping costs. The other one is the potential policy changes and also trade ties following the election result in major economies across this year. And the other one is higher for longer global interest rate levels as a result of sticky inflation. And the other risk to our demand, our economy, will be the China's economy, where currently they, as mentioned earlier, they have issue with their property sector, and which would have impact on the economic growth. So I think that there is a brief outlook on the global and domestic economy. So I end my session today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Encik Imran, for the economics outlook presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, moving on to our main agenda for today with our distinguished guest speakers, of which will be moderated by Dr. Rosnani. We are also pleased to inform that the slides of our speakers are available to be downloaded in the chat box, but only after the session ends. So without further ado, I would like to pass the floor over to you, Dr. Rosnani.
Thank you, Sabrina. Let's have a round of applause for Dr. Raja to give his insight on what would be our challenges and our opportunities to come out from the middle income. Thank you, sir, for joining us again today. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Ruslani. I'm not sure if Imran got my slides, the last one I sent this morning. Have you got it, Imran? Well, then let me see, because he was talking about either me using my slides, moving it. Maybe I use mine, but the share section is not in my hands. I mean, the sharing of slides, it's not in my hands. It's with the organizers. Is Imran still here?
I'm still here.
Yeah, I sent you a set of slides this morning. Did you get it? Is that the one that's going to be used? Because the slide sharing section is in the hands of organizers. It says I can't access it for me to upload my own set of slides.
Okay, let me see.
Oh, you have it there. Okay, but let me check whether you took the one from the morning.
Hold on, I check first.
There's one that I sent this morning, which has got an additional figure just to clarify things.
Dr. Raja, Dr. Nani here. While waiting for the slide to be uploaded by Imran, perhaps you can give some opening remarks first.
Yeah, okay. Let me mention that the slides that I prepared talk about certain aspects of what industrial policy is so that we all can be on the same page. Especially so when there is this notion of both an active as well as a passive set of industrial policies. So I'll try to explain that and then connect that with what's happening around before moving on to look at what industrial policy is normally targeted to do, and then subsequently bringing on the NIMP4. Let me mention that my assessment of NIMP4 here is based on whether it's equipped to bring us out of the middle income trap, rather than a full-blown review of the policy itself, because then it will be that much more detailed. I don't think we have the time to deal with that. So that's basically what my set of slides will do. Of course, in the process, I'm referring to the NIMP4 itself that was launched on the 1st of September 2023. Now, I'm not sure if the slides are back in action. Well, let me say certain things about industrial policy. There are at least two aspects of industrial policy one needs to know. One is the way. Yes.
Excuse me, Dato. Maybe you can try again because they just assign you as a presenter.
Okay. Then I could. All right. It doesn't seem to give me what I'm looking for. Is this on? Is this on?
No, sir. Imran, if you have the slide, can you be the one yang upload it?
Okay, hold on.
Okay, you can then enlarge it. If the screen is full screen. Okay, you can go on to the second slide if this is the one. Yeah, I thought it's important to define certain things so that we will all be on the same page. Industrial policy refers to any government intervention in any sector that manipulates markets. By markets, there economists refer to as relative prices, sorry, not relative market, relative prices for raising economic and societal improvement. The sources are there. This is one where the UNIDO takes that approach, not confined to just promoting manufacturing. Any sector that attracts government intervention by way of manipulating of relative prices in order to promote that particular sector. It can be any sector. But the one traditionally associated with industrial policy refers to government intervention that manipulates markets. Again, here is relative prices with a focus on widening and deepening the role of the manufacturing sector specifically and the industry sector in general, including its appendages of construction and utilities. This is how Adam Smith himself in one of his 5 volumes, excluding the overall volume that he's got, it articulates industrial policy in that sort of direction. And I believe if you feel you need simpler language to understand that better would be Alan Young's 1928 work in the Economic Journal. The last, of course, is Nicholas Caldo, who promoted that as a major aspect of how economics develop. Now, I would then like to distinguish passive industrial policy from active industrial policy, simply because there's been a situation where many countries have attracted FDI because FDI was looking to relocate from the developed countries, largely looking for labor and, of course, resources. And government just responded by way of developing the infrastructure, offering incentives, and improving security and stability. This is like how governments respond to what happens with relative factor endowments in a country to develop the infrastructure to enable the movement of capital from the developed capital surplus countries to the developing capital scarce countries. But active industrial policy doesn't really look at that in that sort of way. Active industrial policy targets economic restructuring towards manufacturing by pursuing strategic industries with explicit policies to stimulate initiation and upgrading. I'll get to those examples. But within this, you have 2 tabs. One that looks at the set of relative endowment they've got, and then at the same time trying to strategically initiate upgrading, a case of leveraging that Ireland and Singapore has pursued. Next slide, please. Again, export processing zones in South Korea. It's not that these countries didn't have that, although they eventually got the economies propelled through active industrial policy, include Masan and Incheon in Korea, Kaohsiung in Taiwan, and of course Singapore. Basically, it started in 1965. Singapore got out of Malaysia, but that's the same time when Kaohsiung, the first export processing zone in Asia, was started in 1965. The earliest, of course, was from the Shannon International Airport from Ireland. Indonesia is from since 1986, Philippines since 1970s, Malaysia since 1970s, Thailand since 1980s, China since 78 when they introduced the economic reforms, Cambodia since 1990s, Myanmar from 1990s, Laos PDR also 90s, Vietnam from 1990s, even though it had its doing more in 1986. It's really after the embargo on Vietnam was lifted by the US in 1994. Initially, initiated largely from FDI inflows, starting with the US, the EU, Japan, and later South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan. Government's rules develop infrastructure, offer security and stability, financial incentives, and literate, not literature, literate workforce. Sometimes the English changes because of the system of how these things work, not because of what I typed there. And in this case here, Penang will be a good example. So will be the case of Malacca, Selangor, and other states that developed the infrastructure, offered financial incentives, and of course brought the labor requisite labor sought by the firms. The argument assumes that specialization on relative sector endowments will lower unemployment and poverty as emerging host sites face huge labor surplus and unemployment, as well as underemployment. Next slide, please. This is what I would refer to as active industrial policies. We refer to government assuming the initiative to promote industrialization with a focus on targeting industries, identifying strategies, including selecting, monitoring, and appraising industrial performance. This is what Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, and China did. China, of course, is both passive and active industrial policies. The Suzhou area would be passive. I think you extended thing too much, exceeding my screen. Okay. Maybe you can go up a bit because it's halfway between 2 pages now on my screen. Just move up a bit. Yeah. Sorry, this is active. Yeah. Okay. Active industrial policies seek to create desired endowments for the country rather than being driven by existing relative endowments. This is the question of the debate between Danny Roderick and Amsden. Amsden, in her book, Asia's Next Giant, often emphasized that countries get relative prices wrong in order to move up from one set of endowments to another at a higher level of value added, while Roderick referred to the same thing, but in the context of getting relative prices right. I'm not sure why he made the point, but I think I'm more with Amsden here. And then, of course, you all are familiar with Arjun Chang's work on kicking away the ladder, as well as Eric Reiner, who explains how the rich countries became rich and why the poor countries stay poor. He then discusses the first industrial policy looking to imitate and leapfrog Britain, the country that industrialized first, when Alexander Hamilton was advising Jefferson, then president of the US. I think the slides seem to be moving most of the time. Now, let's move to the next slide, please. Okay, can we have a full screen? It's okay if you don't have it. Exponents of industrial policy argue that growth in the primary sectors of agriculture and mining supports the emergence of manufacturing, which then complements by creating demand and absorbing surplus labor from these sectors. Of course, there are those who have worked on the margin how these shifts take place, including work that talks about how disguised unemployment is removed from agriculture, because otherwise surplus labor stays there. And then, of course, how manufacturing gets demand from processing, and vice versa, manufacturing supports agriculture by producing fertilizer at a time when the models were fairly simple. Arthur Lewis actually discusses that. The differentiation and division of labor capability of manufacturing then pushes its own growth and that of the other sectors. I think that, you can look at Alan Young's work, which is interesting, I think. There's also this notion of mature deindustrialization and premature deindustrialization. Let's accept that while manufacturing takes over from the primary sectors, there will come a time when the contribution of manufacturing in GDP as a whole tends to decline, especially when services take over to become the main engine of growth. And what this actually means is that you don't have a situation where the share of manufacturing in GDP falls, but you do not see value added in gross output declining. You do not see wages declining. You do not see upgrading falling down. And that's what we call mature deindustrialization, which Bob Rothon and Alan Wells, John Wells discussed in their book, Deindustrialization Foreign Trade, 1987, where they make the point that the US was still a mature country experiencing the support of manufacturing to increase standards of living, while that of Britain was the other way around, which he referred to, the two of them referred to as facing premature deindustrialization. I would regard Malaysia to have been facing that from especially 1999-2000, when the share of manufacturing in GDP reached 30.9%. It's not 30% now, it's about 22% now. which obviously shows that it's deindustrializing. What we have to see whether it's premature or is it indeed the kind of deindustrialization that Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and, as well as the US and Germany are facing. Although Germany over the last 1 year has been really facing contraction in manufacturing, caused largely by this shortage in oil and gas to power its manufacturing. Key drivers of policy, positive industrial policy. Can we move to the next slide, please? Next slide, please. Imran, oh yeah, okay. This is a systemic quote I developed to explain these things. Typically, countries that are evolving, not necessarily upgrading, will have to gradually see basic infrastructure reaching higher levels. Malaysia, I believe, has higher standards of provision of water, power, roads, telecommunications, provision of financial needs. Finance is important, of course. Customs coordination, security, healthcare, and basic education. One can include more of these variables if you so choose to. And then, of course, in order to upgrade, something that Malaysia actually attempted to with the way forward, once our PM then, Tun Mahathir, launched the Action Plan for Industrial Technology Development in 1991. That was to develop the STI infrastructure, science, technology, innovation infrastructure, which focus on creating intermediary organizations like technical vocational training, university education and research, skills development centers, standards organizations, and of course, provision of R&D incentives, grants and centers, related centers, focusing on intellectual property rights, including the filing of patents, science and technology parks, and of course, venture capital that deals with supporting risky startups, for example. And of course, these things came up with our multimedia super corridor, the corporatization of MIMOS, the Human Resource Development Council, and Malaysia Industry Government High Tech Might, and MDEC, which had a different name at that point, but it's known as MDEC now, with support, digital support. And of course, this entire thing was driven by the expansion laying of fiber optics and so on. Now, network cohesion, this to me is an important thing. It's pointless having these organizations or massive organizations if you don't see them connected with firms, the ecosystems embedding firms, because they are meant for supporting them. So if there's strong connectivity and coordination between firms and suppliers and buyers, connectivity and coordination between firms and basic infrastructure, connectivity and coordination between firms and the science and innovation infrastructure, coordination and connectivity and coordination between firms and intermediary organizing customers. These are all critical if we want to see that the laying up of the ecosystem supporting firms are indeed performing their roles. And the last being integration into factory and final markets, integration with input and product markets globally, integration with knowledge nodes globally. By this, if there are, for example, public laboratories, which many textile firms from Taiwan, Japan, and China access in the US, including from MIT, because they don't have that sort of facilities, for example, in their own country, then those things are also important. Human capital suppliers, research universities, integration into global value chains. These are all, I believe, are important if at all you want to see the success, including of industrial policy, because it's, even though the policy is more targeted. Can I go to the next slide, please? Yeah, this is more like the institutional framework for stimulating innovation. At any time, industrial upgrading requires that there's continuous innovation, and that which it's important to support a rise in value added in gross output. The value added in gross output of Malaysian manufacturing was about 28% in the year 2000. At the moment, it has really fallen to 21%, which is a significant relative decline when that of Korea, Taiwan, Germany, Japan, and the US are over 30%. It tells you, because value added is constituted by both profits and wages and salaries. And at any one point in time, a country like Malaysia will depend not just in the development evolution of knowledge domestically, but also from imports of knowledge. While Singapore, Malaysia, and Ireland have relied extensively on FDI, but in the case of Singapore and Ireland, largely through the deployment of leveraging strategies where the governments play a key role on what those multinationals do. That is different in the case of Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, where they have relied on also foreign capital, but through licensing and acquisition of firms. And of course, in that process, they have really been able to evolve national firms that have become world class, like, for example, Samsung in Japan, Korea, and of course, TSMC, the world's leading logic chip firm in Taiwan. And of course, you need to have, in order to transform this, you need to have organizations I would refer to as our metro organizations created in 1991, including the multimedia super corridor, the technology parks, even though our science and technology parks often referred to by people as having become white elephants because not much is happening there. So here you need to focus on both creative imitation and radical innovation. By creative innovation, I'm looking at not just copying what others do, but learning from the process and improving on it. That's what Lin Soo Kim mentions in his Harvard book, From Imitation to Innovation, Harvard University Press, book 1997. What really drove Korea's transformation from low value-added activities to high value-added activities. It's an interesting example because Korea had a per capita income lower than that of Malaysia in 1979, 80 because they had a GDP contraction when their president then, Park Chung-hee, was shot dead by his main security guard, but then subsequently today has left Malaysia behind by 3 times. Korea's GDP per capita with a population of over 50 million is more than 3 times that of Malaysia with a population of 34 million. A similar assessment can be also made with Taiwan, although the ratios are slightly lower. And again, as countries go up the value chain, there needs to be radical innovation. In other words, firms in those countries need to catch up and leapfrog so that they are creating knowledge at the frontier. And this, unless this is done, then you will have countries that only catch up, but not really leapfrog. Next slide, please. I wanted to show this because knowledge synergies associated with research. Knowledge is a public good, which means to say that it's non-excludable and non-rivalrous, even though countries impose intellectual property rights, especially the US with patents, industrial layouts, industrial designs. Yet that knowledge cannot be completely curtailed, though, from its flow to others. Knowledge is like that. Of course, the environment too is that, except that the environment looks at it as a negative externality compared to knowledge, which is a positive externality in that sense. But the demonstration being made here is when money is spent on research, all sorts of knowledge are created there, especially so when those R&D labs or those firms where the internalized R&D are connected with the environment outside there so that, there's coordination interface with commercialization. In the process, you have all sorts of other knowledge that are not used by the firm, and they spill over to other external parties. That those kinds of knowledge cannot be really stopped as such. And in the process, the firm may get patents, designs, layouts, and trade secrets. Trade secrets are there basically if you can't really verify it and can't really stop its move. And therefore, you use a trade secret, even though others can get to use it. It's just like you have a KFC flour out there. If you want to fry Kentucky Fried Chicken, which is a trademark. But then again, the market is not driven by that sort of knowledge. Now, coming back to the non-pecuniary knowledge spillover, which is knowledge that is not sold financially. The patents, designs, layouts, and trade secrets can translate into pecuniary or monetary spillover. The other one, no, it is appropriated by others, and because it's appropriated by others, that's the reason why government should really take control. They should play a key role in funding that sort of knowledge creation, because society as a whole benefits, not just the person who invests. And it's government's interest to see that the economy as a whole develops. So if that knowledge is converted back to money, some call it development, some call it commercialization, some call it innovation. This is the point I'm making because we in our country seem to have seen a relative decline in GERD, which is the gross expenditure in R&D over GDP of 1.4% in the year 2014. It's fallen to 1. In fact, it was less than that in 2019. Let's go to the next one. Yeah, this is Malaysia's industrialization. We have had IMP 1, 2, and 3 that sought to promote industrial upgrading but lacked proactive government role to ensure upgrading, which is why we are still languishing in low and medium value-added activities. Heavy industrialization was pursued since 1981 but lacked government focus on technological capability building. There was really no serious focus on it until in 1986 when I had the first IMP, but that too was relatively passive until, of course, the science, technology, innovation infrastructure was evolved in 1991. But then, of course, we had problems with that. I will mention it along the way. The way forward of 1991 drove the establishment of the STI infrastructure to spur technological upgrading. Problems of selection, monitoring, and appraisal, including the kind of leaders put up there, resulted in the dissipation of innovation rents so that little upgrading actually took place. I'll show some figures in the subsequent slides. Consequently, Malaysia has faced premature deindustrialization since 1999, which has translated in slow GDP per capita growth. The innovation performance of Malaysia can be deduced from patents filed in its leading manufacturing industry, semiconductors, compared to South Korea and Taiwan. Next slide, please. This is here the red line actually shows the share of manufacturing in GDP. It's it's fallen relatively, especially from the year 2000. But there has been a slight rise, slight reindustrialization taking place until the year 2022. I think the manufacturing value-added growth is reflected by more crisis times when things fell during the 1973-75 oil crisis, the first one, and then of course the 1979-80 second oil crisis. Then we had the 97-98 Asian financial crisis, subsequently the global financial crisis, which also experienced a contraction. And of course, the last one being a decline that took place because of the outbreak of COVID in 2020. But there has been a relative rise, but the rise isn't really promising a big jump, except that we'll have to look at the NIMP4 if indeed it is promising us a leap where it'll help the country break out of the middle income trap. Next slide, please. Yeah, here if you see this GDP per capita of countries, and if you look at Malaysia, this is GDP per capita. It seems to be one where it tended to slow down a lot more, but instead of looking at the gradient, it's better to look at the gap that's been left behind. And you will see that Singapore has overtaken Japan. And so is the case of overtaking the, yeah, it's overtaken Japan quite significantly. In fact, the GDP per capita of Japan in the year 2023 is actually 82,000 US. And in fact, in the year 2023, the GDP per capita of Korea and Taiwan too, also largely because of exchange rate fluctuations and so on, have overtaken Japan. Both Korea and Taiwan have per capita incomes higher than that of Japan. Malaysia's in 2022, I don't have the 2023 figure, is slightly less than 11,000, which is 10,900 something US dollars in current figures. Next one, please. Next slide. This is patent filing. If you look at the figures here, you'll see how far behind Korea and Taiwan has left the rest of the countries I have here, which is Malaysia and Thailand. Whether it's and much of what Korea and Taiwan have achieved, they've achieved to their own national capital. You see, they are significantly that much higher. In the case of Malaysia, there is a growth to the point where the foreign filing of patents in the US is higher than the national filing of it, although overall it stands extremely low. Next one, please. Key goals and targets of NIMP4. The NIMP4 is predicated on lifting economic growth in Malaysia by intensifying manufacturing growth. Interesting. In fact, I was hoping to see that we indeed become developed, which Malaysia would not like to see that. Now, my own feeling is the whole thing was predicated on transforming, achieving exponential growth with manufacturing as the engine of development. With a focus on moving manufacturing from low and medium value-added activities, the NIMP4 seeks to stimulate its shift to high value-added activities. To me, that's a noble goal. The injection of that dynamism is projected to stimulate GDP growth from 3.8%. At least I had a preliminary figure, but I see from Dr. Roslani as well as Encik Imran, it's scaled down, revised 3.7% in 2023. But this is one where it has to rest on 6.5% mean annual average growth rate over the years 2023 to 2030. But we already see the forecast that for 2024 will be 4.7% from both Dr. Roslani as well as Encik Imran. Now, for me, it's not so much whether the GDP grows, but whether that sort of rapid growth can be achieved in order to bring about the transformation in progressive wages from 2,600 per household, this being the mean in 2023, to 4,500, more precisely 4,110 in 2030. That's the area where I'm largely concerned about, because it doesn't look realistic to me, and I'll come back to that later. The NIMP4 is targeted to assist Malaysia achieve developed status by 2030. Of course, it's written there by 2027, they should be able to achieve, provided those growth rates are achieved. The target year retains the shared prosperity vision in an overall sense, because that's the one that Tun Mahathir launched in 2018. Table 1 shows the goals and targets of NIMP4. Can we move to the next slide, please? These are the goals and targets. Economic sophistication. In the very first place, I found it somewhat alarming in the sense that, for me, Hidalgo and Houseman, the guys who came up with this complexity of exports, economic sophistication that they move up, is predicated on measurements that don't make sense to me. In fact, I told that to Hidalgo when I was visiting Harvard. Now, I make that point because the measurement is taken from the SITC code or the HS code. SITC stands for Standard International Trade Classification, which comes to 6 digits. 6 digit is the exporter and the importer, 5-digit combination of them. And then HS goes until 8, which is much more detailed, yes. But you can't really measure sophistication on the basis of those codes. A person like me who's got real feel of the data set will tell you that at the 5-digit SITC level, because the 6-digit SITC level will be the exporter, 5-digit will have microprocessors, will have dynamic random access memory chips, will have read-only memory chips, will have capacitors, resistors. They all vary in terms of sophistication. Surely they all vary in sophistication. So I'm not sure how that sort of measurement allows you to actually capture whether the economy is becoming more and more sophisticated. Now, based on that, they come up with the share moving from 8.1% to 15% in the year 2030. 8.1 is 2023. And then, of course, the gross expenditure in R&D as a share of GDP, which I mentioned that it still remain 1 in the year 2023. And to raise that to 3.5. This too looks somewhat too high for me, because even Singapore's is lower than that. You have Korea and Israel being the highest at 4.5%. I'm not sure whether this is achievable. It's not really clarified in the NIMP how that sort of expansion can be made possible. And then, of course, the move to high value-added jobs. One, to skill them. Yes, there's been a focus on technical and vocational education, including trial run with firms voluntarily participating with the government putting the subsidy, and then to see that there's a fair income. That's what I believe is meant by progressive income. Now, the median in 2021 was 1976. Of course, that median in 2023 was 2,600. Then, of course, they're expecting that to go up to 4,510 by 2030. The question is, how will this be achieved? Because it requires that the GDP grows in real terms by 6.5% per year. Yet next year we will only achieve 4.7%. Now, domestic linkages here, I'm not sure whether the economists define the way they have done, because they're looking at two things. One of which is, in this case, SME competitiveness internationally. How many of them are engaged in exporting? I'm not sure whether that exporting means more than 50% or just getting into exports. And of course, I suppose must be the second one. And in here, it's 11.7% in 2023 engaged in exporting activities among the SMEs. They are hoping that that share would go to 25%. Now, domestic value added in manufacturing. Here, I found this not really something reflecting the linkages, because linkages are also, in a way, clusters. Except the clusters are more refined in terms of how it's defined, with sectoral differences. The connectivity requires that you have buyers, suppliers, and so on being captured in there. I would use Marshall as the person who first used the term, though many of you know the Harvard guy on these things. Now the 49% of value added in manufacturing, as it is now, the share of manufacturing, as I mentioned earlier, the value added overall for manufacturing in the year 2021 that I got from UNIDO is only 21% of gross output. So I'm not sure how this figure was computed. I couldn't see clarification on that, and that they're expecting it to rise to 65%. Now here, the second one is domestic sector and regional development. The extent to which these things spread across the domestic sector, and there's a mention of realized investment. Realized investment and approved investments are two different things. Typically, when firms apply, they don't just apply to one country. They apply to a number of governments, and they look at the kind of incentives they get, and they choose that, which means to say realized investment will always be lower than approved investments. Now, this, I'm not sure whether, because the realized investment is the term that's used there in the report, but I think they're still capturing approved investments. It's a bit like suddenly you may have many companies like Tesla agreeing to relocate, approving, accepting first, and then subsequently making a decision to move to Malaysia. That's what Tesla did. Elon Musk did that after agreeing to go to Indonesia. Second part of it, develop clusters in existing and new markets. Now, I'm not sure whether the term cluster is being appropriately understood here. That's my query here. Perhaps I should speak to those who came up with that report. Inclusivity, here, global market share in domestic manufacturing. I would assume the term inclusivity is involving those people involved, and if that's the case, it's my understanding here is they are looking at how domestic firms are increasing their shares in global markets. If that's the case, then I think that's good. But again, there is no serious explanation on how the transition was derived from 13 to 25%. And then here is manufacturing value added in poor states. I think this is a good good point in terms of how you move the domestic value added from 22% in the poorer states, which of course include Kelantan and perhaps Sabah, and that to 30 to 35%. But what I found interesting here that's missing is you can't possibly use that as through federal policies. If you look at China, for example, China has managed to reduce inequality between provinces by central government initiating first, provincial government coordinating or intermediating between the central government policies and the county and municipal bodies. And then, of course, county and municipal bodies are the real implementers. Do we have such an institutional framework to coordinate that way? In a way, you can look at Penang. If you look at it, Penang and Kelantan were classified as poor in 1970. Where has Penang gone compared to Kelantan? You have to understand the kind of policies that were put in place, direct coordination involving the CM, which somewhat seems to have fizzled out now, where states were taking direct responsibility in handling these institutions. I hope that sort of coordination is very much part of it, which I didn't really see in the report. Now, enhance the ESG governance, which is environmental and social governance. That's, of course, is in line with the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change, which after the Paris Accord that spoke about capping temperature rise to 15% over the next 100 years, with 2005 being the base year. Now, this of course also is in sync with our attempt to become carbon net zero by 2050. That seems like, which means to 100% by then. As it is now, I'm not sure where this figure 56.5% was derived for the year 2023. And then carbon net zero at 33%, or perhaps that's okay because we are looking to at least get to 45%, which is the nationally determined contribution we pledged with the UNFCCC in 2030. Next one, please. Next slide, please. Missions and enablers of NIMP4. The NIMP4 called for five missions. Advanced economic complexity, tech up for a digitally vibrant nation, push for net zero, sorry, four missions, safeguard economic security and insecurity. And then, of course, the enables, mobilize financing ecosystem, foster talent development and attraction, establish best-in-class investor journey for ease of doing business, introduce whole-of-nation governance framework. Next one, please. Next slide. Here are the four missions and the four enablers. Mission one, largely the idea comes from Mariana Mazzucato, who had both broad-based mission as well as specific missions. And in here, they adopt the broad-based ones, which is what the EU was doing for a while. But though the EU now has, with the EU Chips Act 2022, as well as the Biden-Harris government that have launched on a large scale the funding of even basic assembly of chips and electronic goods, following the US attempt to contain China, which means to say that they have to contain imports from a country that by 2017 had already accounted for over 50% of the imports of chips from the world. And that means resuming these things that they were doing many decades ago. But in here, mission one here, there deals with advancing economic complexity. As I have already made my point in relation to what that actually means. I mean, why don't you then just simply use value added as a share of gross output, especially so when the measurement on trade terms doesn't really give you what you are actually looking to measure if we really have the feel of the data. Tech up for a digitally vibrant nation. That is fine if you are looking at IR 4.0 technologies. In fact, we have a global player here in Aerodyne that is doing very well in the service part of especially drones. And of course, many other are emerging. They are key, though, in terms of how we transform productivity and the share value added and gross output. Then the next mission being pushed for net zero, which is a globally driven agenda that is important for the rest of the world. Otherwise, we may see the extinction of planet Earth. And therefore, I think that's a good initiative, except that I'm not sure whether we are really doing it realistically. I would hope that the source of energy that we use, for example, to charge EVs, electric vehicles, don't come from coal-fired and gas-fired electricity by TNB. Otherwise, it will be classified as greenwashing. And then the mission 4, safeguard economic security and inclusivity, including that of food security, which has become a serious problem. Now, the enablers here, mobilizing financing ecosystem. I suppose the action plan will follow from here, because there isn't really much written there, the sort that we had even, say, in 97, 98, when we introduced capital controls. We gave special loans for portfolio investments that were meant to end closures, not just closures, the absorption, acquisition of bad loans, bad debt. Enabler 2, foster latest development and attraction. 3, establish best-in-class investor journey for ease of doing business. And then, of course, enabler 4, introduce whole of nation governance framework. This is the one I found it somewhat problematic, because especially so when Malaysia has introduced the corridors. I think it's better to coordinate either through the corridors or particular locations, so that the coordination between the localities, meaning municipalities and counties, with the state government or provincial governments, and with the federal government, and back and forth coordination, which I think not only will capture the interest participation of these local localities, but also at the same time ensure that the flow of information will see that the interest, the ends that are defined by both the federal, the provincial, and the locality will be achieved. And let's go to the next slide, please. Can the NIMP help Malaysia become developed? I think it's ambitious planning. I actually like the fact that only our country can become developed. We should have become developed much earlier, if you ask me, which needs courage to establish. In that sense, NIMP is, to me, a massive show of courage. But my concern is whether the pillars that bring those or seemingly translate into that achievement are on strong ground. I have my concerns there. The use of a dashboard to monitor and govern upgrading is good. Definitely is good, because you have a dashboard and you already define what upgrading will be, and then you see whether firms are actually moving up. But unfortunately, that doesn't really show a taxonomy on the basis of trajectory, though. For example, we have chip design, but how do we get there to the frontier or even leapfrog the way, say, Samsung did in memories or TSMC did in logic chips? That's not clear to me. The governance targets show little understanding of manufacturing to me, especially lacks a profound taxonomy based on trajectories to stimulate upgrading from low and medium to high value-added activities. I have a book forthcoming with OUP. Maybe once it's out, I can bring it to you all, but it's on textile firms in Pakistan, because the number of firms are large enough to support quantitative work. That shows a taxonomy on the basis of trajectory and how industrial policy can actually target and stimulate the movement of firms from one level to another, and then finally reach the frontier. Shortcomings in the understanding of economics and how policy connects with governance makes the plan weak. I found the plan largely weak, except that I like the idea of the country becoming developed. I like the idea of wages rising, median wages rising from 2,600 in 2023 to 4,510 in 2030. But it's not really explained in a clear way. can the 6.5% per annum average annual growth in GDP be achieved? As it is now, we have not faced that except for the year 2022, but that's only because we had a contraction and slow growth the years before, the 8.7% that we achieved in the year 2022. The transformation of the economy to record an annual average growth, GDP growth of 6.5% over the period 2023 to 2030 requires serious justification, as GDP only grew by these figures. It's 3.7% will be revised down in 2023. The emphasis on identified sectors require realistic grounding. I think they need to have realistic grounding on this, including leaders from industry, not the sort of guys that we have here, like the way Maurice Chang went to Taiwan. He was leading the world's then top logistics firm, Texas Instruments. He was the senior vice president. He had a vision that people will believe. So when he went back, he not only saw that he had a different business model without a brand name, without designing, but he also was in contact with buyers, suppliers, and research R&Ds. What I'm referring to, world-class institutions there that allowed him to visualize how Taiwanese firms, in fact, there are more than 100 semiconductor firms that he drove largely, he orchestrated from the year 1980. And the industrial policy for them was only there until the year 2000, which means to say that that was achieved in 20 years. The choice of chip design without an emphasis on mass assembly driven by R&D is bereft of an understanding of Malaysian endowments. We took up chip design. I can understand why Singapore took it up, because it hasn't got that sort of endowment to have large-scale assembly. In fact, they are scaling down on the support for semiconductor firms in Singapore. But we don't have that sort of problem, and there I think there needs to be a rethinking there. The argument on economic complexity needs better measurement techniques, not the one that Hidalgo and Hausmann have used, which they've also used in their recommendation for Kazakhstan. The enablers described come out disjointedly. A focus on the ecosystem would have helped. The embedding organizations that support firms. Therefore, I say that I'm not really convinced that I am before or first the direction for Malaysia to break out from the middle income trap to become developed by 2030. In fact, it's my hope there will be a revision of this so that the country's fortunes will be in line with what we all Malaysians are hoping for, that we become developed, and not just developed, but resting on an engine of manufacturing growth that can be sustained for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you.
All. Yeah.
That's all. Dr. Chandra, Professor Raja, thank you so much for the insight. I think Malaysia badly need some injection to actually lift our economy, and it could actually come from the manufacturing side now. We are actually, okay, if any other participant would like to ask any question, they can always ask, but let me start first. Prof, if I may ask, what is actually Malaysian problem that we're not able to actually lift up ourselves to become a high income nation? Because we have been shifting our goalposts, I think from 2020 to 2024, now it's 2027. One, what is our challenges? Two, what is the next target for us to cross the finishing line to become a high income nation?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Let me just mention that one of the first things I would expect, in fact, I also advise government on the payroll of UNIDO, for example, on industrial policy. Now, my understanding will be that we have a profound review of the past industrial policies, especially the preceding one, and to see why we have not achieved the objectives set out by INP3, for example. That would be the first one I would have expected. The second thing I would have expected is to look at this stylized model that most people use, which is the systemic quad, to see if those pillars are on strong ground to support firms, because they are there to support firms to upgrade, not just to perform. For example, if you are just using competitiveness, the revealed competitive advantage doesn't say very much, except to say that in a particular sector, with that particular niche, we are competitive. That's what you'll say once you exceed 1 in the measurement. What it doesn't say is whether that particular competitiveness is achieved in a high value-added activity or in a low value-added activity, which may explain why we haven't progressed very much, even though we launched the semiconductor industry in 1970 effectively, although policy-wise, we often say 1972 with the free trade zones. But in the case of Taiwan, which started later, it has already got world-class firms. That's a case in point. Now, I think if you had a taxonomy that gives you the different levels of technological participation by firms, that talks about how technologically advanced that they are, either by way of value added or by the way of the sophistication involved, by looking at the product category individually rather than taking up those codes that are used by trade classification and so on, then you can see whether our firms are moving up. And you can see that in the case of Taiwan, it's not just the SMC, the United Microelectronic Company, Taiwan Mask, Vanguard, Winbond, the whole lot of firms that have managed in their respective years. Now, what I would expect is for that sort of track followed by our observers, our policymakers, to see whether our firms are indeed upgrading. If they are not, find the reasons why they are not in order to solve those problems. And in this case here, I think it's relatively easy to look at the 4 pillars I'm talking about in order to see that we build relationships between them. And I think it's possible if they are looking at how industrial policy is actually executed. And if we take the Singapore approach, which I'm not against, which that relies on a leveraging strategy where we offer incentives and so on to bring in foreign firms, we have to then impose certain standards that they need to do by way of, say, they investing in R&D, they hiring skilled people, they participating in segments of the value chain that actually moves up. For example, even allowing for their national firms to participate, like Foxconn. Foxconn even does R&D in those kinds of inputs it supplies Apple, for example. Foxconn is a Taiwanese firm. Now, those kinds of strategies to me are important to be set in, rather than just seeing that they export. And then we need to see whether these organizations, we have to review why MIMOS hasn't done well, and including the firm that MIMOS have launched. Silterra is also has already been sold effectively. And being a strategic industry, we shouldn't have done that. But if we are not performing, how long will you last? It will only dissipate economic rents. So my feeling is these things need to be addressed in order to, in other words, we must have a set of targets that should be looked at, and this NIMP4 at least has that. That means every year they have to look at the firms to see technologically where are they moving, except that I don't see the taxonomy there though. That they need to do for the different respective industries because they differ with industry. So my suggestion is these things need to be done.
You mentioned in your slide just now that Malaysia face slow economic growth post we slow down on our industry activity. Can you shed some light on that? I think is it in 1990s?
We have had a fluctuating sort of growth, but we had rapid GDP growth from the year 1990 to 1997 until the economic crash because of exchange rate crisis. In fact, on average, we grew by 9%. That's probably the highest growth. But although, of course, for me, from 1990 to 1997, the growth was largely supported by what we call overheating, economy membahang, because our balance of payments faced a chronic deficit, growing chronic deficit. The reason why the GDP growth was high was largely because of FDI and largely from Northeast Asia and Singapore relocating in Malaysia, which obviously meant that GDP was growing. We were even facing problems with power supply and so on, which drove the emergence of independent power plants. But other than that, once we recovered from the Asian financial crisis, our growth rates haven't really been significantly high. We have rarely touched 5%. It's, from then on, although we have had a 8.7% growth in the year 2022, that's again I mentioned because of largely a contraction in 2020 because of COVID, abrupt intrusion of COVID that led to that massive contraction. And then, of course, a slight recovery before that 8.7% was achieved. Now we've gone back to 3.7%, hoping to achieve 4.7% the next year. But remember that in order to achieve the target set in NIMP4, we need to have 6.5% annual average GDP growth rate, which is significantly higher than what we've experienced since the year 2000. So that's what I mean. The trend has shown a relative decline. Remember that in Korea, the entire 1970s, they achieved over 10% annual average GDP growth rate, the case of Korea. And China too, in many years, grew more than that. To me, that sort of rapid growth is possible because we are not at the frontier shape, meaning creating new sources of knowledge. We are still looking at and adapting in that sort of way, finding different ways to do things differently, cheapening in the process, and at the same time enjoying higher rents. Rents here I'm not referring to as corruption, referring to in the recording of value added. That's the sort of point I'm trying to make.
If there's any question from the floor, you can just ask Professor Raja while I'm asking him several questions from the chat box. There are some questions here that I would like to get your insight. As we all know, Malaysia is good in planning but quite poor in execution. What is your opinion, sir?
Let me get to the chat box. I think for Malaysia to continue with the correct policy and continue implementation, continuous implementation would require a strong and stable government. I mean, that I really think indeed we need a stable government. That is true, but that's not enough. Without stable government, you can't possibly achieve anything. That's also true. So my own take on this is we need to now do the things that we require in order to look at our own missed opportunities. We were actually at a time when China was into communism, at a time when there was a rebellion in Philippines, the transition economies were still way back, not integrated in the global economy. The opportunities were that much more. Maybe we became somewhat complacent without really focusing on industrial upgrading. I think industrial upgrading should be the basis because economic development eventually means that the living standards of the people improve over time. That's why I mentioned earlier the UNIDO definition includes that society evolves to enjoy societal benefits. That's part of it, not just recording economic growth itself. Now, the thing that I would like to emphasize is it is also true that the sort of election results we've got seems to give the indication that we are not really having a government that is fully focused on realizing economic synergies. But that's something that Tun Mahathir enjoyed before, but still we didn't. And therefore, my feeling is that while ensuring that we remain a stable government, we need to see that we are doing the right things to transform the economy in such a way that it becomes self-sustaining to record continuous growth. But of course, there will always be blips in our GDP growth because we are a highly integrated economy. About 200% exports and imports as a share of GDP. Of course, imports and exports are in gross value, while GDP is in value added. That's why it makes it look somewhat odd, but that's the case. Singapore is even higher. So we are highly reliant on external forces. If suddenly the US collapses or something happens, if, for example, the Fed chief in the US races, although he hasn't done over the last 3 times, retaining the interest rates at 5.25% to 5.5%. But in case, say, he ends up raising that further in order to cap inflation, and that results in, say, a slowdown or a recession in the US, it will have a bearing in some ways. Although this time, it to me, will be different because we are less reliant on exports to the US. Although our exports to China, we are relying on China quite a bit now, but that should mean that we are hoping, as what Imran mentioned just now, hoping that the property issue doesn't blow out in China, and that helps us to resume exports to them. But the thing is, I feel much of it is dependent on what actually we do. We have been doing a lot of manufacturing from the year, especially from 1972, when the export processing zones were created. Now we just have to see why we haven't really moved up. Why is that Singapore has got a per capita income of 82,000 US, yes, in the year 2023, way ahead of even Japan. And while we haven't reached 11,000. My feeling is one can work out on that basis to see how we can reorganize our strategies to achieve those kinds of goals. But except that we are a much more complex economy, as opposed to how the EDB, Economic Development Board, runs Singapore. It's a much smaller economy, more easily coordinated. Are you, Dr. Roslani, going to give the next question, or am I going to read from here?
Yeah, before you go to the chat box, I just have a question. You mentioned just now that we need to avoid greenwashing because we need to ensure that what do you call the charging station for EV car does not use coal-fired fuel or even the fossil fuel. Can the government ascertain this when they are actually aiming for 10,000 EV station nationwide by next year? Will they be able to do this by ensuring that the one for EV is using for other than coal-fired or even what you call fossil fuel?
Actually, there's a forthcoming chapter in a book on Oxford Handbook of Green Industrial Policy. The chapter on Southeast Asia was done by me and my former student, Dr. Gopi Krishnan. It's already in press. And what we see is it's a problem facing the whole world. Greenwashing is around everywhere. What it actually means is that so long as you're reliant on petrol and diesel, so long as you are reliant on natural gas, so long as you're reliant on coal, you are basically converting what raises carbon dioxide emissions. And in that, the only big difference being that you have a situation where, in the case of Malaysia, we've launched 4 large-scale solar supply in megawatts through solar photovoltaic cells over roofs, solar panels, and then of course we are expecting to derive more energy, renewable energy. Although our share of renewable energy hasn't gone up, only the Singapore shows some improvement, even though their starting base is extremely low, the lowest in the whole of Southeast Asia. But they are showing positive improvement, perhaps maybe because of the introduction of carbon taxes, which I believe the Bursa players are involved in seeing its implementation in Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, and Indonesia. Now, what I see there is initiatives that are taking place that are promising, but perhaps maybe one should quicken those initiatives. That is, becoming less reliant on coal, for example, imported coal, or natural gas. Timor-Leste no longer exports, hasn't got any more to export anyway, natural gas. Now, that's what I mean. But again, this is not a serious worry internationally, because greenwashing is a problem all over the world. As what the Third World Network reported, many developed countries themselves haven't moved away. The only big thing is the sale of EVs means that you don't see the fumes of the cars because you don't have the combustion engine. So the EVs that are driven don't have the combustion engine at all. So you don't see all these fumes coming out. That's a positive thing, though. And of course, we just read today, Tesla is building a supercharger, the biggest one in Malaysia. So that's something positive, I think.
Having said that, Prof, is Malaysia on track for net zero emission? I mean, I know the target is 2050, but we have to measure ourselves. Are we on track? Is there something that a lot more to do compared to other countries?
I don't really see a reason why it's not achievable, except that we need to have a plan B to see if there are things that are random that happens because we didn't anticipate them, how we deal with them. To me, that because as it is now, we on the basis of what the NIMP presented, let's assume that figure is correct, which means to say in 2023 they have achieved 33% reduction in carbon emissions. Then they're expecting that to fall to 45% in 2030. And if that indeed takes place, I think that because of the fact that you build momentum from there, it's possible that we can achieve the net zero target by 2050. But of course, we need to also see what sort of mechanisms have been developed. Of course, they're working on it. The Bursa companies in charge, including, I think, Petronas, to see how these things are to be met. Again, that too, I feel, will benefit from having a taxonomy of what targets to be achieved and the sources through which these targets can be met. How much more solar panels, except that solar panels cannot be used in the nights. I myself have solar panels over my roof, but of course, you know that the electricity is more expensive during the day as opposed to over the night than the day, between the grid that receives and the grid that sends out. So my feeling is, so long as we keep to those targets, so long as we have a transparent way of showing this, it's not, to me, wrong to reveal these things. I don't see a reason why they should be confidential. And I feel that sometimes consumer groups do offer comments, criticisms that can be useful. So in one short answer, yes, I think it's achievable. We still have 26 years to go. And the trends, although of course renewable energy as a share of total energy consumed remains something that has been declining. That means the consumption of energy is rising faster to the point of still dragging sources from fossil fuels. Remember that we have also slowed down the construction of hydro dams, discouraged by the UN because it tends to destroy forests, it tends to remove trees and so on. But Singapore doesn't have hydro dams, and the same thing. Indonesia, Thailand, and the Philippines and so on are also facing a relative decline in renewable energy as a share of total energy consumed. And in their case, of course, much of the renewable energy, the share is higher than that of Malaysia, comes from hydropower.
Prof, I think one last question. How does this NIM 4 address issues related to sustainability and environmental impact in industrial development, given that specific focus by the government on this selected sector that we discussed just now? If I remember correctly, automotive, what do you call E&E and whatnot. So how does, what would be the government what do you call direction on the sustainability environmental impact on all this? Yeah,
they have placed ESG targets. Yes, they have placed net zero targets too. What I would like to see is perhaps maybe they didn't have the time to put those details out there, how these things can be achieved, the taxonomy to show that, and then to see if at all in any of these sectors. Because the greening of manufacturing requires that we move not just to completely EVs, but also the use of inputs that pollute. Perhaps maybe they're waiting for the introduction of our carbon tax, which will be done by the key players that will put around to derive that the way, say, Singapore has done. It's on inputs. So my feeling is, as it is now, the NIMP4 cannot really be blamed as such for putting that up within a broad-based, the Mariana Mazzucato sort of approach to set those kinds of target as a mission. and then the enablers to achieve it. But my feeling is for it to be more concrete, it will be useful to look at that taxonomy. It's like, let me give you an example. I visited Shenzhen, and then Huawei had laid something like 200,000 CCTVs up there, and there they are able. You can drive your car, you can look at on displays, falling emissions, the entire thing you can see, because they have put those things up there, and then the rate with which they decline, to the point where it is not just dealing with ESG issues, it is not just dealing with ensuring there's decarbonization or reduction in greenhouse gas, but also the fact that the whole synergy involves a serious decline in accidents, jams, and so on in the city of Shenzhen.
Sorry, Prof, one last one. Your view, the GDP target of 4 to 5%, you think there's a chance for us to cross the 5% GDP, assuming if let's say that manufacturing is actually in full power and services in full power. Your view, sir?
See, it's good to include services because many classify R&D as services now, when at one time it was an integral part of manufacturing. And of course, the services that entail the use of less humans, that entail lots of knowledge, particularly through digitalization and digitization. Now, which means to say we're dealing with IR 4.0 in addition to the all infrastructure in more robots and drones. But my feeling is with regards to manufacturing, what I don't really see, which is what my concern is, taxonomy showing taxonomy based on trajectory, showing levels where with the interventions the government is putting up, you will see a movement of firms upwards. Now, I'd like to see that because that's a key for me. In fact, whenever I'm dealing with UNIDO policies, that's one thing that I seriously emphasize. Now, my feeling is we have aerospace, for example, where the 12 Malaysia plan has allocated 1 billion ringgit. But how does aerospace figure out in our NIMP4? I don't see much of that there. So that's why I'm saying that that we need to really rethink to some extent. We need to rethink and put those things up there so that we have a robust set of instruments that we can look at in case, say, we are not achieving something, to identify the reasons for not achieving the kind of growth we are hoping for, and then to rectify those things. Of course, some aspects of it require corrections, like if you have a adverse external economy. In the Malaysia plans of the 70s and 80s, early 80s, not much after that, we had both a profound review of domestic economy, why certain things are happening, certain things are not happening, including how revisions were done to FELDA and so on, so that productivity in FELDA, RISDA, and so on actually rose. I have a book with Tan Sri Kamal, Driving Development. It actually discusses about how corrections were made. Now, from about mid-80s, we have only targeted in our Malaysia plans external economy and see how we should adjust. I think the other part too is important. They should make sure that Malaysia plans looked at shortcomings within our own domestic economy and what should be done to correct them.
I think to sum up what we discussed today, the issues and problems or challenges facing Malaysia is more of structural that will take time to actually address. Although I think that the government is doing all it can to actually address that adequately. But then again, we hope that Malaysia will finally be able to cross the high income nation. I think, but then again, with a drop in ringgit, it could be quite challenging for us. But then again, ringgit is on the road to recovery. I think today, as we speak, ringgit has rebounded nonetheless. Professor, thank you so much, Dato' Professor Ulung Dr. Raja Rasya, for actually joining us again for the what do you call economics corporate day. It's always a great insight to hear from him as he is actually has a direct connection with the government, advising government on the policies and whatnot, sir. Your parting words before we end your session, sir?
Yeah, I'm hoping that we achieve just like your expectations and your hope. I too have the same expectations and hope that our the set of policies we have continue to see that the restructuring will take place. But let's just hope that what we have identified as a structural problem for a long time will not be repeated in the next few years, so that we resolve them, so that we achieve what we are hoping for. Thank you. Which is
Thank
to
you,
make
sir.
Malaysia a developed country. Yeah.
Yes, thank you, sir. Thank you,
Yeah.
Professor Datuk Professor Ulung Dr. Raja, for joining us today, for the great insight that we have on the NIM4. We so much we want to know about this. We actually learned a lot from him today. Thank you, sir. Yeah, Sabrina, over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Raja. Let's move on to our next speaker, which is Professor BGR Chandran. Okay, thank you.
Can you hear me? Let me share my slide.
Prof, thank you for joining us today again. Yeah, we would like, we is actually we are waiting for the direction on the manufacturing, which has been a drag to the economy last year. Perhaps we can get some confidence on how things are going to pan out in 2024, in 2025, given all that actually happening, especially on what they call E&E, 5G and whatnot. So, Prof, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Rosani. I hope you can hear me clearly, and you can see my slides. Yeah? So for today, what I'm going to do is basically to talk about a bit on the future of manufacturing for Malaysia and what is the implications of that to the growth prospects for Malaysia. So what I've done is that I've structured the outline, giving you some context in terms of macro conditions, and then I'll bring the discussion with regards to manufacturing sector's progress, and we'll discuss a bit on the key challenges in the manufacturing sectors, and also within the context of the policy, what Malaysia have done in that context and how that would translate into the progress of manufacturing sector in the future, and also what would be the implication for growth for Malaysia. Yeah? So as you know, if you look at the global outlook, I think Imran had given some insights on this as well. The projection by IMF is more positive. It's more optimistic in terms of growth prospects. So they have predicted about 3.1% and 3.2% respectively for 2024 and 25. Whereas the World Bank has given a more kind of downward numbers, which is about 2.6 and 2.4%. So 2.6 in 2023 and 2.4% 2024. The reason being that the assumptions are a bit different within both the institutions. IMF is looking into greater expectation of resilience among the bigger economy, the US and other larger economies, whereas they are also predicting that inflation will be a bit manageable in the future years. Whereas in the context of World Bank, they are cautioning about the slowdown due to tight monetary policy and restrictive financial conditions that we have currently, and also due to the sluggish kind of performance in the global trade and investment. If you look at the projection for China and India, the two important large economy, we see that China's projection is a bit lower for IMF than compared to World Bank. And given that China has a very big share to the global world trade is about 10%, and to the GDP is about 18%. We cannot ignore the progress of China, and Malaysia is also an important partner for China in this context, given the export trade that we have with China overall. But what is likely to be seen here is that India might be growing much faster than compared to China. So in that context, it's very important for Malaysia to have also trade negotiation in India to the larger extent to benefit out of this growth. Basically, to leverage Malaysia's position in terms of you know, um, trying to plug into the global value chain or the Indian value chain as well. And ASEAN as being a very important partner for Malaysia as well. So in that context, given these numbers, ASEAN is predicted to grow about 4% plus in the future years. Going back to the Malaysian context, if you look at the quarterly figures year to year, you can see that the last 3 quarters we have grown about 3%. And the projection that we have currently for the growth prospect for 2024 by Ministry of Finance or even the Bank Negara has announced this is between 4 to 5%, which I think is achievable in that context. But whether we'll achieve 5% is still depends on the external shocks that we have within the context of demand, given that current progress is driven by domestic demand in that context. Yeah. And World Bank and IMF is predicting about 4.3%, whereby ADB is predicting about 4.6%. But to get a higher number, as what we have discussed just now, moving ahead about 5%, I think there's a lot of structural issues that we need to consider, especially to improve the manufacturing contribution towards the GDP. The current contribution is about 24%. We used to have about 30% in the past, in the 80s and 90s. But after the financial crisis, our share of manufacturing contribution to GDP has been declining. So it means some call this as a premature industrialization within the context of Malaysian economy. But I think there is a possibility to revive those positions to make sure that manufacturing contributes more. But that depends on how do we drive the value addition within the context of manufacturing. And looking into subsectors of manufacturing are very critical in that context. So later I'll go into some of these subsectors and discuss further how they're moving forward and what is the challenges that we have within the context of Malaysia. If you look at the industrial production index growth, it has been slowing down in the past few quarters. So we have not reached, say, 3% and above. During the last quarter is about negative 0.1% growth. But what you see in the trade data is that you have a recent trade data on January 2024. There seems to be upward trend in terms of growth for Malaysia in that context. So the recorded growth for 2022 for industrial production index is about 6.8%, while for 2023 is about 0.9%. So it means we need to further improve that condition for the years to come. And I think because of the better scenario for growth in exports, whereby you see about 8% increase in January 2024, I think with the recovery, we can target a higher growth for your industrial production index. The projection for IPI is about 3.7% for 2024. I believe that that is achievable to some extent, given if we have the momentum of growth growing along the years for the rest of the month. So in that context, I think there's a positive sign. Even if you look at PMI index, for the January and February, we have a better pointers. It's about 50%. So meaning to say there's more positive outlook for industrial growth in that nature. And the important thing that we require here is basically government intervention to some extent. Number one, in terms of government reform, that is central for the progress of the manufacturing sector. The other thing that we need to look into is the investment part of it. So both domestic and foreign direct investment. I think we are seeing some positive figures for the coming quarters with the context of foreign direct investment. And also domestic demand in that context. And due to the slightly exponential expansion in terms of budget, which amounts to 339 billion and 90 billion going to development expenditure, those projects can also bring in some positive impact towards the economy. So this is a figure for total exports growth for Malaysia. So it is in terms of adjusted value, seasonally adjusted. So it's about 13% growth in the last month, in January, sorry. And looking at the structure of the total export growth, then we can see that ASEAN, China, US, EU, and Japan represents about 67% of the share of the Malaysian total export. So the progress of these countries are very crucial for Malaysia to also make headways in terms of export growth in the future. And what is being predicted is that the global trade is expected to recover in 2024. So that is a positive sign for Malaysia to move forward in terms of contributing in terms of growth for export, which will translate into economic value for the country in terms of GDP. So the forecast is about 3.3% in merchandise trade, that is goods trade in 2024, while IMF is also predicting and forecasting the similar growth rate for exports. So that would be something which is positive for us, because given a small economy, export plays a very important role for the Malaysian economy. If you look at the manufacturing value added by sector, this is by per percentage of GDP, then we can see some of the important sectors that we have within the context of Malaysia. One is the electronic industry, which contributes about 5% towards GDP. Second one is the refined petroleum products, which contributes about 4%. Then you have chemicals and chemical products and pharmaceutical products, which contribute about 2.3%. So the challenge will be, how do we increase the growth of this, or even increase the share of value added within the context of manufacturing. So for that, I think there's a lot of new discovery need to be done within the context of the industry. Innovation is key. So that is why even if you look at the NIMP, there's a mention of R&D, research and development activities within the context of some of the targeted sectors. So that is critical for us, because with new product, new processes, then productivity and other things can be improved. And that would bring more value addition towards the industry itself. So the strategy is to improve the value addition activities so that it can contribute more to the share of GDP in that context. Yeah? And it also depends on how firms are positioning themselves, the firm strategy itself, what kind of products are they moving forward, how do they diversify in that context, because that is critical for us to look into in the context of value addition as well. I can give you an example like Infineon and Intel. They have different strategies. Infineon has announced expansion of the activities in Malaysia because they have targeted the automotive industry. So the main target is EV industry. So their chips and other things are going to the EV industries, and this industry is booming. So therefore, the derived demand for that industry is becoming larger now. So there's a lot of demand, and they are expanding due to that. Whereas Intel has targeted different sectors for their byproducts, and that has some implications in terms of how they move forward in terms of expansion and so on. So they are not expanding in that context. So the strategy is very important in this context, not only at the national level of how government are planning in terms of moving forward the industry, but also about how companies are positioning themselves to create demand and move forward. Yeah, so that also contributes in terms of value addition at the larger context. Right, a bit on the global investment trend. If you look at the global investment trend, then as a whole, if you compare 2023, 2022, ASEAN reported about 16% decline in FDI. But as for manufacturing investment, the region recorded about 37% jump in greenfield projects announcements. And we are seeing a stronger growth in Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, and including Cambodia in this context. So there's some positive signs towards getting adequate foreign direct investments for us to move forward as well, especially in critical sectors. And I think it has been timely for us to concentrate on sectors that matters most, that could have more spillover effect within the context of the industry itself. So it means targeting is very important in that context. So we cannot just simply consider any types of FDI, but be more specific and being more targeted so that it can have more spillover effect for the entire industry in Malaysia. Yeah. If you look at for Malaysian condition, then you can see that Indonesia is much, I mean, they're able to attract more FDI than compared to Malaysia. China has been the #1 in this context, and then followed by India and Singapore. Singapore is much way higher than compared to even Malaysia in this context. So I think we have to do much better, but we see a positive sign in terms of numbers across years. Slight increase for Malaysia's position, especially in 2023, where you have secured quite substantial amount of FDI in that context. But comparatively with other countries, we have to do much better to bring in more foreign direct investment if we were to promote some of these industries that is basically requiring new investments. And importantly, we need to also target new industrial sectors whereby that could propel a lot of other sectorial progress within the context of Malaysia. Going back to the export itself, we can see that manufacturing exports contributes about 70% to the total merchandise exports for Malaysia, and about 84% for total exports. And in comparison, if you look at countries, then we are doing well in that context. I mean, we are far better than many other countries. But if you benchmark with Singapore and China, I think the share is still relatively low. So the idea is how do we strategize and promote higher exportation if you were to use export as the channel for you to grow, as a channel for you to promote your growth in this respect. Yeah. The challenge will be how do we position the SMEs, small medium industries, to move forward in terms of exporting. So I think we do have the SME blueprint. Currently, SMEs are only contributing about 38% to the overall export that we have. So increasing that number to higher position requires a lot of strategies on our part, and also ensuring that SMEs are able to learn how to export is also critical in this sense. In the past, many of them learn how to export from supplying to multinational companies, for instance. And in that context, the learning takes place. Of course, we have Matrade and other agencies who are facilitating these exports, and we can do much better in that context in terms of bringing a higher value for small medium industries to participate in exportation. And with the improvement in infrastructure, ICT, and so forth, there's a more potential for us to really contribute to the total exports, especially services industries, for instance. You can leverage on the platforms and other things for you to move up the ladder in terms of exporting. But what is lacking here is basically many of the firms do not know how to do it, so they need some form of facilitation in that context. If you segment the manufacturing exports, then you can see the three key pillar industries which are contributing largely for the manufacturing exports. The first one is E&E, which contributes about 47% of the manufacturing exports. And within E&E, semiconductor is the largest, about 31%. So this industry is very critical for Malaysia, not only for exportation, but also because this industry has a lot of other spillover effect for other industries as well. Because it supports a cross-cutting kind of industry, which supports many other industries, and the linkages of this industry to other industry are critical in that sense. And this industry is also technologically advanced, so it's critical for us to further move the E&E industry to a larger extent because of the critical contribution of the industry towards others. Yeah. Chemical is about 6%, but there are more potential for us to move further. If you look at the ownership structure for chemical industry, it's about 50-50. It means we do have a lot of local players within the chemical industry, which is something that we need to look into, and because domestic firms are there, and we can leverage on that as well to move forward. Yeah. Of course, there's a lot of critical elements which are missing within the context of the industry, like R&D, for instance. How do you move into advanced chemical, and how do you bring other byproducts out of this industry so that you can move up the value chain, and also in terms of value addition for the industry itself. Petroleum contributes about 20%, 12% towards the manufacturing exports. So these are key sectors that we need to focus on. So if you look at the graph, then it gives you more insight about other sectors like telecommunication, the office machine and automotive, automatic data processing industry sectors, electric machineries, and so forth. So that gives a kind of comparison for you to understand how we are progressing. So you can see the widening gap where semiconductors takes the whole chunk of the E&E sector compared to others. That is followed by the petroleum products at a larger context. Okay, so in terms of growth, so you can see a kind of declining trend for 2023, although we have like rebound from 2020. Starting from 2021, we had some positive growth, but again, 2023 was downward. So this is largely because there's a contraction in terms of trade, global trade. But what is predicted for the coming years is that there will be a positive growth. So in terms of January number, if you look at the E&E year to year, it has contracted about 6.5%, and semiconductor has contracted about 8.5%. So there's a decline, large decline in that context. Of course, exchange rate volatility will affect sectors differently depending on trade partners and subsectors in this context. But in most cases, you can see a positive kind of implications to trade in these sectors. So as a whole, there's a kind of positive scenario for exports because of the prediction that the world trade will rebound to some extent because of recovery in some of the largest economy. But that also depends on how we strategize ourselves and then restructure ourselves in terms of export destination for us to take advantage the untapped market that we have within the global scenario. It will be interesting for us to also look into the export structure in more detail so that it gives us some idea about what are other kind of product that we champion in terms of what competitive advantage do we have within the context of the export structure. So of course, integrated circuit is the largest, about 20% of the overall export, then followed by refined petroleum, about 10%. Then your petrol gas is about 5.6%. And then you have the bigger chunk of palm oil, about 4.6% as well. So others are quite minute in terms of export structure. The critical industries need to be resilient in the future for them to even contribute more. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to also to diversify our export structure if we were to increase the value addition of the other industries through different intervention strategies. That requires a lot of planning, a lot of insights, getting insights on the sectors and understanding how the sectors or what are the challenges for the critical sectors that we have so that we can unbind those challenges and move forward. In terms of destination, Singapore is still the major destination market. So as a whole, within ASEAN, Singapore has been one of the key country. Then if you look at other ASEAN countries, then it will be Indonesia and Vietnam, and also Thailand. Then comes China, which means surpassed the United States in the past. So in the past, we had the United States as a critical destination, but that structure has changed over the years, in the past few years. So China takes about 12% of the whole exports of Malaysia, followed by United States, which is about 11%. So it gives you kind of a glimpse about where we are exporting to and how this market, the changes in this market will affect our exportation. So that would be something that we need to look into when we strategize in terms of ensuring that we can manage to some extent the external shocks that we have within the country. I'm also giving a bit of snapshot about product space. So most of the analysis that the policies are looking into is basically exportation. But I think it's critical for us to also look into the product space, how these products are connected to one another. Because that connection, that network is very critical, because an improvement in one sector will have an effect on other sectors as well. So here, this is a study about product space where they link the network connection of one product to the other core product that we exported. So it is useful for predicting future exports. It's useful for you to about how do we relate this product to one another, and what will the implication of this specialization of certain products, or even targeting certain industries to other industries. So the blue one, the blue dots that you have here, is more of semiconductor E&E related industries. So they are much more connected, if you look at the case of Malaysia, to many of the other products as well. If you see the yellow one is more of palm oil based product. So they are less connected. So if you compare these two sectors, for instance, then E&E creates more kind of linkages to other products. So it means it links to many other exportation. So that increases the value of exportation at a larger context. Right? So this understanding will give us some critical information of how we can further look at the linkages of products at product level rather than being at the industrial level. Yeah. Okay, the other missing part within the context of Malaysia is the service exports. If you look at the total service exports and imports, Malaysia is at a deficit. So meaning, say, we are importing more services than exporting. So if you fragment those components of your service exports and imports, then you can see imports are more related to transportation. Even personal travel is much more than other business services. So if you look at exportation, then personal travel, that is more of tourism, exportation. Then you have other business services, transportation, computer information services, business travel, construction services, and so on. What is happening currently is that if you look at the proportion of services trade as compared to goods trade, there is a large increase in the services trade currently. So there's a lot of argument on that within the context of developing country, whereby developing country can take advantage of services trade, which creates more room for us to move forward. Yeah? Because services don't require a lot of capital investment in that context, so it is much easier. The barrier to entry is also smaller as compared to manufacturing, especially to set up businesses and so on. So if we were to position ourselves, then we see a lot of rooms in terms of improving the services trade within the context of Malaysia. Business services, for instance, we need to see what is stopping them from engaging in exportation, or even computer and information services, for instance, and so on. Financial services, a lot of banks have moved up to ASEAN countries, but not further than that. But of course, that is more than just banking services, but also other support services that can be given. Yeah. One interesting thing that you can see here is the royalties and licensing fee here, which relates to the payment for technology that you do, or even for copyrights, are much low. So it means we are getting technology from outside. So we are paying a lot of royalties and licensing fee for that technology. So we are adopting technology rather than innovating in this context. So if you were to change this position in terms of exportation or importation, or in terms of service trade, then I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of how do we position ourselves as a technology mover, so that we can sell technologies to abroad, yeah, and gain revenue out of that. Yeah. So the current prediction is that 69% of the global trade is in services. But more interestingly, those services are intermediate services. It means services that helps the other exporting sectors. So it's like indirect services and indirect services in this context. I can give an example. So maintenance services for automotive industry is something that we call as intermediary kind of services that is given for the particular industry. So like that, I mean, when you talk about Industry 4.0, then I think there's a huge chunk of opportunity that we have for services. So if we can position our SMEs and other businesses to take advantage of these um, service industries, then I think we can move forward. Yeah. Tourism, the problem with tourism is that it does not really generate that much of income. Of course, tourism is big for Malaysia, but the value addition may not be comparable with when you compare business services or even say consulting services and so on. Yeah? So it generates more value addition in that context, and it's more knowledge intensive than compared to tourism industry. So that are sectors that we need to talk about. So the idea is, how do we connect these services to even manufacturing? So how do services support manufacturing? Because the whole structure of the manufacturing industry have also changed. So we call it servitization of the manufacturing industry, whereby the service industry can contribute more than the manufacturing to a larger extent. So the idea is, how do we link these services industries to contribute or to even complement the progress in the manufacturing industry. Currently, when we analyze the data, there's a lack of coordination in that context, meaning, say, services are not linked up with manufacturing sectors. So if you build that connection and coordinate that well, then we can see much improvements in terms of productivity and other things. Yeah, of course, there's a lot of initiative undertaken in pushing up digitalization, for instance, and other initiatives. So that is something which is positive, because the ICT sector, which provides the services, can leverage on the progress of the manufacturing sector and vice versa. So that would be something that will create much impact for the economy as a whole. Okay, I'll discuss a bit on the challenges now. So although we have progressed to some extent in terms of looking into how manufacturing has moved forward in terms of value addition, but as a share of GDP, we are still seeing a decline. So currently it's about 23%, 24% of the GDP. Yeah. So in terms of manufacturing sector. So I think Prof. Raja has also talked about that, and we have agreed that there's a lot of structural challenges that we have to solve in order for us to move forward. Yeah? So the context should be in terms of how do we improve the value addition activities of the manufacturing sector. So for that, I think there's a lot of things to be done. One is, how do we look into even promoting innovation within the context of the sectors? How do you provide proper skill sets and knowledge so that they can upgrade themselves from one position to the other position? Number three is about, how do we ensure that technological progress happens within the context of the manufacturing sector? That has been slow in many years. And this is not something new. This has been here for many years as well. So hopefully the new industrial master plan can address some of this with a proper diagnosis of the challenges within the context of manufacturing sector. Of course, competitiveness, we're still maintaining certain competitiveness, like for E&E, we're still competitive in that sense. But we have to also link productivity progress within the context of the sector so that we can be more resilient, because there's a lot of low-cost production which is coming in, and that could also drive a lot of investment to other countries like Vietnam and so forth. So they are becoming more competitive as well at the larger context. And technological change also very critical, because if you don't upgrade technology and if you don't upgrade your product in that sense, then it's very difficult for you to maintain the same competitive advantage, or even to move further with the competitive advantage. Yeah. One critical element is that the linkages with SMEs. Yeah? So we have to ensure the SMEs are competitive enough. We have to ensure that SMEs gets those spillover effect or the trickle down effect so that they can also be more resilient in the future. And to some extent, the new development like digitalization and sustainability are affecting the SMEs much greater. Even to the context of if you want to plug into the supply chain of the multinational companies, nowadays they are requiring SMEs to be more sustainable because that is a requirement by their home country, the HQs, which is abroad, whereby because they are taking all these sustainability issues very seriously. So if we don't push SMEs to move into sustainability, then they'll be caught because they may not be able to plug themselves into the supply chain. Because currently, if you go into scope 3, for instance, in terms of managing your sustainability issues, then that involves the suppliers. So if you're unable to be a supplier, then there'll be great impact for SMEs development in terms of exportation and also in terms of their value addition in the long run, right? Of course, the other thing that we need to look into is how do we promote new product development? How do we promote new process development? Or even how do we promote new services in this context? So innovation has been challenged. The government has given a lot of incentives in this regards, but still we are not seeing larger context of Malaysia becoming the innovation hub at a larger context. Yeah? So comparably, if you compare with other countries, even if you compare to Singapore, we are not reaching the target as what we wanted to. So in that context, innovation has been very challenging. Promoting innovation within the context of industry is very challenging because of the high risk and uncertainty within the context of coming out with new products and services. Yeah. So incentives works to some extent, but not, it's not really widespread in that context. I'll talk about a bit on the policy context, whether this policy would be able to also revive the position that we have within the context of manufacturing sector. So the recently launched NIMP 4 has very ambitious target. So what they have done is that they have taken the challenges and goals and assigned missions. So the idea is to be more targeted, and missions are driven by the government themselves. Yeah. So it means you do more targeting or specific industry, and then you try to develop those industries. One positive development in the context of the policy is that they have focused on implementation and its governance. Because largely the last critics of policy is that it's not being implemented correctly, it's not being governed correctly, so therefore there's a lot of policy failures. So in this policy, they have also looked into how do we implement them so that we can see some results out of the policy. Yeah. But my take on this is that most of the intervention implementation requires institutional reform. Without this reform, it's very critical, very difficult for you to move further. You know, so it can slow you down in terms of implementing, or it can will not give you the impulse for you to move forward. Yeah? So what is required is also institutional reform. So it's not just focusing on implementation, which is too narrow. So what kind of reform do we need to do, right? So regulatory reform, for instance, are very critical in some areas. Some regulatory reform can be done very fast, but some requires a lot of time. So that can also be a kind of pooling factor, a pooling factor for you to implement certain policies. Yeah? So nevertheless, the policy also highlights that there are key enablers, but as what I see within the context of institution is that it's not just enablers, it's a driver. So institutional reform becomes very critical driver for NIMP, yeah, because it is driven by the government themselves. So we have to get this right so that those policies can be implemented appropriately. So when I say they are drivers, it means the policy and policymakers must be able to know how to use the functional, vertical, and horizontal policies effectively. They have to know how to coordinate initiative, actions, and activities, because we see in the past there's a lot of systematic coordination failure within agencies. So that limits you from progressing, even from implementing those policies effectively, right? And also the ability to interpret policy documents correctly. So when it trickles down to say state level or even at district level, for instance. Those interpretations are not there. So in that context, it's very important for us to translate this in a very meaningful way so that people can understand, the implementers can understand those policies much clearer. Yeah. So of course, the ability to implement and deliver, which requires resources, not only in terms of money, but in terms of the know-how, right? So the policymakers must be able to, have certain knowledge and skills, right, in order for them to implement. So if this is rightly done, I think we can see some progress in certain industries, targeted industries that they have mentioned. But mind you, that mission-driven kind of initiatives are very time-consuming, and it's critical that policymakers has the insights. So for that, you have to be doing certain things based on data and based on evidence, yeah, for you to move forward. All right, so a bit on the approach to problems and actions within the plan. In my opinion, we need to align the challenges, mission, strategies, and action within the plan. What is required here is that, of course, the plan is there, but we need to have accurate diagnosis of the challenges for action plans and implementation. We need to understand how certain parameters within the context of industrial progress are affecting one another in terms of causality, in terms of complexity, and so on. And also, we have to know what are the limits of some of these indicators and measures that we use. Right. So sometimes we are very obsessed with the indicators, but we don't know what is the true measurement of the indicator, or even what it measures. Yeah? So that misinterpretation are often occurring across policymakers. Yeah. And also sometimes there's also misinterpretation of about why certain things occurs. Yeah. So when you talk about productivity, for instance, why productivity is low among firms, we don't really know the challenges of the firms themselves. So it means it requires some form of understanding from the policymakers at a firm level on some of these lacking, so that they can implement certain strategies more effectively. Right. So in totality, what I'm saying here is that the question is not why, but the question is how do we do it now, right? So we do have this NIMP, but how do we do that? How do we strategize and implement those things? So the question of how is very, very critical. So that requires a lot of engagement with stakeholders so that they can know the how part of it, so that it can be more meaningful to drive industrialization process. Yeah. And our observation also shows that there are many sets of problems and multidimensional complexity within the context of industry that we need to take into account. Yeah. Also, because this plan requires a lot of coordination, there's also a challenge of co-creation. So meaning to say that how do we share KPIs within agencies so that they can work together and move forward. Yeah. It cannot be like separate KPI for each individual institutions and they do it themselves based on that KPI. Yeah. Because here it requires a lot of kind of working together and coordination. So if you don't do that, then there's no motivation for agencies to come together. That is the critics in the past due to the lack of coordination between agencies. Yeah. And also we need to map up cross-cutting tasks, activities at product and technological level so that we can understand them further. And also some of the targets need actions. Yeah. So meaning say, how do we translate this into actions? Yeah. Say so sustainability. So just now there was a question about net zero. So how do we translate that? Right. So we know that we are going to reach this by 2050, but how do you translate that at a firm level, for instance? What is a firm thinking in terms of going forward towards net zero, for instance? Which firms, which sectors are we going to target first? So how do we move on that? So how do we even thinking about how do we reduce the cost structure for adopting some of this green technology, for instance, for them to move into net zero? So all those are very important questions that we need to think of if we were to transform the industrialization process with some of these actions. Okay. I'll go a bit on the mission-based discussion, as what Prof. Raja has also mentioned. So there are 4 broad missions. So one is advanced economic complexity. Of course, this economic complexity, just now I showed you the product space. We can also look from the product space itself or technological space and how they are interconnected. So some product can be very complex product and some product can be very simple product and so on. So how do we advance that complexity? The idea is that it is based on a theory where a country which has more economic complexity are growing much faster or even having better growth than compared to other country which are not having a higher index or economic complexity. But I mean, of course, we also have to look into some of the resource-based industries because they are also very important along the way. So it's not only high-tech kind of sectors that we need to focus on, but also some other sectors that can be very, very relevant in the local context, which are very important for us to move forward. Like food industry, Thailand's food industry are more creative than or more innovative than compared to Malaysian industry. So how do we change this scenario so that they can be more competitive in the market? The second mission is that technology uptake for digitalization, push for net zero, and then safeguard economic security and inclusivity. In total, they have about 9 projects for the missions. So some reflections on this mission-based approach. This is not something new. We were doing targeting in the past as well, but we were doing more broadly. So if you look at NIMP 3, for instance, the Industrial Master Plan 3, they have included all industries within the context of the plan. So that is not very well targeted in that context. But of course, you have the advantage and disadvantage of targeting. So if you target the wrong sectors, then if that sector is not moving up, then your investment in those sectors will not be giving the expected return in the long run. So targeting approach, here we must be very clear about what we are targeting. So for that, we require a lot of evidence and proof saying that these are the sectors that we are looking into. So the idea is whether we want to target and create new competitive advantage. And for that, you require a lot of foresights for understanding how this industry can move forward in the say next 10 years, for instance. Also, targeting needs entry points. So entry point can only be understood if the value chain is mapped within the industry. So you can't just say, no, I want to target this industry, but what is the value chain of the industry itself? How they are connected? Who are the players, for instance? What is the gaps within the value chain so that we can promote an ecosystem that translates the industry to be more competitive. So the idea of ecosystem here is very, very critical, right? And we also have to understand a bit on the limits of export-oriented industrialization strategy because it also has some implications for domestic investment, right? And also the foreign direct investment-led kind of industrialization strategy for upgrading. So meaning say certain countries have taken a different position, but Malaysia, Singapore, and so on have taken FDI-led strategy. But there are some limitation because the spillover effect of that is not great enough in terms of industrial upgrading. Of course, we see some form of learning from multinational companies, especially from foreign multinational companies, but we don't see a widespread of spillover effect in that context. So there are some limits in terms of FDI. So meaning say we must also look into how we can strategize and improve the domestic firms' capabilities, or even upgrading in terms of product technology and so forth. So the other short-sighted view is that the plan is only for 7 years, but see industrial structures, we need to have a long-term plan to move forward. But of course, this is a good start for now. But hopefully, we can see some progress and monitor their progress and evaluate those key indicators, so that we can learn from it and then improve it further and then extend the period of the policy. So what I'm saying here is that what is critical here is that the institutional capacity and capabilities to implement some of these projects, and also having better foresights in terms of how do we look into the industrial structure and how do we move forward in terms of value addition. Yeah. Of course, the challenge will also be, because this is a top-down approach, then it will be a challenging. Yeah. But of course, there are some strategies to have public-private partnership kind of initiatives to move along with the industrialization process. So that is something which is welcoming in that sense. But again, sometimes we tend to pick winners, sometimes cherry picking in that sense. We can be more favorable to one company or one industry than the others. So there's some disadvantage on that. So you can have a crowding out effect if you do that. Yeah. So you have to be a bit careful in terms of how do we manage that. So that gives you a kind of whole perspective. So my take is that we are seeing some positive trends in some areas, and we are also seeing that there are some initiatives from government. At least we announced certain policies so that we are a bit concentrated and targeted in that sense, which can revive the manufacturing sectors. But of course, there's a lot of things to be done. If you were to revise the contribution manufacturing to the GDP, I think there are more challenges as well. So we need to take advantage of all the other new development that we have for us to use that and leverage on it. Yeah. So with that, thank you very much. I'll be happy to be taking questions from the audience.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. Let me take a few questions first before we pass to Imran. You you flash a slide, says here earlier on that IMF GDP projection for ASEAN for 2024 is about 4.7. Then it's going to come down or moderate to 4.4. I can't help but to wonder, is it because of China effect, the slowdown in China, because China is also expecting to moderate the growth in 2025 because of the problems they have there. I mean, World Bank is quite okay, ADB is quite okay with our forecast, but not the IMF. Can you share some insight on this?
Yeah, I think, I mean, because of the sluggish trade position between global and the China, I think they have downgraded that a bit more. So I'm not sure. I mean, I have not gone through in detail in that perspective, but I think, I mean, it all depends on how China is reacting towards certain uncertainty that they have. So I think you're right in that context. It's a China factor again.
So you think because our trade coupling and economic coupling is actually have some direct impact to us. Once China slow down, we're gonna get the flu as well, right?
Oh yes, that's definitely, yeah. Because our independently exports to China is quite large as well.
Yeah. Okay. The impact, Prof, on the ringgit that is so competitive now. You think would that have a lot of bearing on the demand for manufacturing goods?
Usually it will be positive in this context because it's cheaper to buy Malaysian product at large. So in terms of exportation, yes, we can benefit out of it. But of course, I mean, it also depends on the industry itself. But largely, what our estimation, what it shows that we have a positive impact. But what is bad is that the importation. So because we rely on capital imports, capital goods imports, so that is translated into cost because your production cost increases. So say you're buying machinery from somewhere, from Germany, for instance. So that inflates your price because because of the depreciation in the exchange rate. So that will translate into cost. So that cost will also impact the way that you're going to export, right? So meaning say your exportation price will also be higher. So if that translates directly, then you would also see some kind of decline in the exportation. So it depends how much the costs are being transferred in that context. So I think stabilization of exchange rate is critical in that sense. So for you to have more kind of reasonable rate is critical because we do depend on a lot of imports in that sense.
It's interesting that you use the word stabilization, not the ringgit that is so competitive. So you are in line with the government that they rather see Bank Negara, that they rather see that ringgit stabilize rather than not too volatile, so that they are able to actually accurately determine the cost of their investment or whatnot, right, Prof? Am I right?
Yes, yes. Because when we study, so we look at the volatility of the exchange rate and that implication of that volatility on your export and import, on your trade performance. So
Yeah.
the volatility is the one which makes it worse in terms of whether your import is going to increase or export is going to increase. So trade performance are being benchmarked on that. So usually we use the real exchange rate to look into the volatility in that context. And it's also bilateral sometimes. So it depends on the position of one country to another country. So sometimes you have bilateral agreements. So some countries are moving into other currencies as well. But in that context, I think the volatility makes more sense than just looking at the value.
When we talk about manufacturing for Malaysia per se, we can't help to think that our ever dependence on foreign worker, will that come to a stop at any time? I mean, we hear that the government is actually talking about moving up the value chain, becoming more of a value-added producer instead of just what do you call, producing goods and whatnot. Your view, Prof, because I think it's never ending. The foreign workers has touched, I think, what 2 to 3 million, and they're even asking even for more. So this is very worrying because it's becoming a social cost to the government for all this. Your view, Prof?
Okay, my view will be see the argument of foreign labor is that they are unskilled labors, right? so that because of that foreign labor, you're not upgrading yourself in terms of value addition and so on, right? But my argument will be foreign labor still contributes to the production and manufacturing sector, but what we have to do is that we have to ensure that this portion of the foreign labor are not being marginalized and discriminated. So meaning say the wages are so low, so you're trying to maintain the wages as low as possible for you to be competitive in the future. But we can't hold on this low wage kind of strategy anymore. So meaning say in that context, you need to also bring in more quality foreign direct investment in that sense, so who will be able to pay higher as well. So our wage has been stagnant for many years. That is that is done purposely because we want to make it more of sustaining competitiveness in the long run. But I think that cannot happen anymore. So we have to look into how do we position ourselves, even increasing the proportion of foreign labor to be more skillful in that context, because some of this work is they're not taking up the employment of locals because locals are not interested in doing such a thing, so such kind of jobs and activities. But rather, I'm looking into how do we position themselves to contribute more. But that productivity will only come in when you restructure the wages. So the labor market, we need to do something with the labor market to make it more attractive, and also to make it more reasonable in terms of compensation and other things. Yeah, because that will translate into consumption and other things in the long run, which can also benefit. So we need to understand the whole ecosystem, how it works, and how we can take advantage of that. So that requires a lot of data crunching to look into how one industry's labor increase, wages increase will translate to cost to other industries, right? So we do have all those tools that which can use to make more insightful kind of arguments. Yeah. So even when we talk about SST increase, right, from 6% to 8%, there's a lot of arguments in the newspapers and so on. But that is basically opinion-based kind of arguments, right? But this 2% increase in tax, what will it translate to, for instance? So if we have proper assessment on that, then we can make more better judgment in that context and move forward. Yeah. So it has positive and negative impact. So it depends. It also depends on how much the government is going to spend on the additional revenue they're getting, right? So how much that will translate into multiplier impact for the economy, right? So like we can use input output table and then compute all this and then see what is the end result, the net result of it. So I think many of the times we are not going towards that. We are only giving opinion piece about how this will translate and so forth. So I think on the part of the government must also translate this adequately to the public. So meaning say the communication of government, when they take certain position for certain policy, they should be able to communicate this effectively to all the stakeholders. If they do that, then there will not be a lot of backslash in terms of thinking about why the government is increasing and so forth. Yeah? So that translation don't happen that smoothly.
Okay, Prof, I know we have exceeded slightly our time, but if you allow me, we want to know if, based on what your finding is, the geopolitical tension and the Red Sea conflicts, is there any impact to Malaysian manufacturing sector other than the rise in transportation costs? Your view, Prof?
I have not studied specifically on that impact, but I think it will have some impact in terms of through the channels of transportation costs. But again, it depends on where you export and so forth. So I think, I mean, based on opinion, this is not based on what I've studied because I have not done the data crunching on that. But I think the impact will be minute in that sense.
Your view is going to be minute. We are of the view that after a while we come to adjust to the situation, the stress that we are facing on that, just like we adjust ourselves during COVID-19. Now, Prof, before we end the session with you, do you have any parting statement or parting aspiration for Malaysian manufacturing sector? I mean, given that they contribute, I think 30% to the GDP. Your view, Prof?
Yeah, now my view will be, I mean, if you allow me in that context, I think if we implement the policy rightly, I think we can do wonders in that context because Taiwan and Korea have done it in that perspective. I think also it requires a lot of mindset change within the manufacturers as well. Seeing and taking opportunities of new development, for instance. Because most of the time when we talk to the manufacturers, they are seeing everything as a cost. So I think that perspective should change a bit because you can translate this as an opportunity. And the other thing that manufacturers should have is the ability to self-discover. Self-discover here means even to diversify from one product to another product. So we are seeing that kind of ability is very limited within the context of manufacturers because of the risk involved. So I think if the manufacturer can be more kind of futuristic in terms of thinking, then I think they can position themselves much better. So it means the strategy need to be right for them at firm level. So that is very important. So how do we translate that? Yeah. So it's not only the part of the government doing the job, but also the other stakeholders within the context of the economy. So if they can position themselves in terms of self-discover, of course, that requires a lot of facilitation of information, knowledge, and so on. Yeah. So the sad thing is that they're not seeking enough knowledge, enough information for them to move forward. So I think that would be something that I would like to highlight here.
Prof, thank you so much for yet another insightful presentation by you. Let's hope that a year from today, when we meet again, let's say for the same forum, that a lot of our manufacturing sector have done some justice for Malaysia after the contraction last year. It's kind of the drag to the GDP last year, and we hope that the manufacturing upcycle this year is going to come through, given that all that's happening. Prof. Chandran, thank you so much for spending the time with us. I think you have been very cooperative all the way. Yeah, thank you so much on behalf of the management, Bursa Malaysia, and also BIMB Securities. Thank you for participating in this. With that, Prof, I think allow me to pass the baton to the MC to carry the corporate day through for the final leg of it. Sabrina, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rusani. Thank you, Professor Chandran. And thank you to our wonderful speakers and to the entire guest today. Hoping we have gained as much input as possible. As a reminder, the slides of our speakers are now available to be downloaded in the chat box. And before we end our session, please be informed that we are now flashing the QR code for learning hours and e-evaluation. Just a minute while my colleague flash the slide. Okay, so yes, the QR code is now flashed, and we appreciate your feedback for further improvement. And for those who require CPE points, we would like to remind you to submit the pre-assessment, post-assessment, as well as the post-evaluation form for you to be eligible for the CPE points. So should you have need any assistance, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. With that, thank you and hope to see you in our next event. Assalamualaikum. Oh yeah, just a reminder, the link is in the chat box as well.
Sorry, can I know the trainer's full name?
It will be typed in the chat box.